Ash was an 8-year-old kid, stuck in a tiny village where every day felt way too small. One day, he rushed to Father Folk's house to ask whether he could borrow a book, and Folk, who'd been dozing on his seat, ringed by piles of books, slowly stirred. He jolted awake to the sound of Ash's voice. He demanded, "Is Ash David's son?" And Ash snapped back, "Yeah, I'm his." Folker leaned in and asked what Ash wanted. Then Ash lit up and admitted he just wanted to read a book. Folker flicked his eyes over the mess of books around him and realized they'd turned filthy from sitting there, untouched and forgotten. Then he leaned in and demanded to know what Ash planned to do after devouring a book like that. Ash grinned and said he'd read purely for the thrill, not the homework. Folker blinked, totally confused, and asked what that even meant, so Ash dove into it. In a world that chews people up, reading was their escape hatch, something that kept your mind from snapping. Ash jumped right into what happened the day before, when the village chief's wife invited the kids to join a reading session. That's when Ash finally got it, when he buried himself in those books. The noise in his heart went quiet, and he realized that in their empty, unforgiving village, books weren't just good to have, they were necessary. Even though Folker agreed to hand him the book, he still pressed, asking if Ash could actually read it. Ash finally admitted he couldn't do it, and begged Volker to teach him how to read and write. He declared that teaching others was the priest's sacred duty, and then straight up begged to be Folker's very first student, especially since Folker had just been sent to their village all the way from the royal capital. In the end, Folker flat out refused to teach him how to read or write. Nash turned to them and asked to borrow an easy book. Folker shot Ash a sharp look, wondering if he truly grasped what books meant and what disasters could follow if he ruined one or even tried to sell it. Ash promised he'd be extra careful not to damage it, but he still pushed back, claiming books naturally break down with time. Folker had to admit it was true, but she shot back that books don't last forever. They'll sag, rot, and fall apart no matter what. Ash then leaned in and demanded to know just how long it would take to read every single book in the Focus collection. He argued that if books were doomed to decay when nobody reads them, then it's better they get worn out through use than sit there perfectly untouched and die anyway. Folk nodded like, yeah, Ash can talk people into anything. Then Ash jumped in and asked to borrow the books, saying he'd memorize every letter himself, only for Folk to hit him with, "Nope, that's not something you can just pull off so easily." Ash made it crystal clear this whole memorize the letters by himself thing was never going to be a cakewalk, and Folk admitted, yeah, it would be tough, no lie. Ash didn't argue one bit, he just pushed forward with his real ask. He wanted to borrow the scriptures Folk brought out during festivals, or a textbook that laid it all out, or even a book packed with sermons. Folker didn't waste time. He nodded, reached into his own stack, and handed Ash the manuscript he'd written himself. Volker promised him it didn't matter if the manuscript got wrecked, and Ash thanked him, then leaned in and scrutinized every single page like his life depended on it. Then he pushed Folker to spell out how to read that one sentence, only for Folker to remind him, "You promised you'd memorize it yourself." Ash didn't back down for a second. He swore he was going to do exactly that. So Folker stepped in, called on the wolf god, the monkey god, and the dragon god by name, and begged them to bless the day with their overwhelming power. He stopped, and Ash immediately said, "These are the holy words I recognize." Folk admitted he'd taught Ash the line, then waved him out and told him he was free to go. So Ash nodded again, thanked him one last time, and headed out of the house. As he turned away, it felt like he'd just kicked open the door to joy in his life. He looked back on his roots in Noskola village, a far-off backwoods spot, and he couldn't help replaying blurry flashes from his past life. Those memories blurred so badly, he couldn't even picture the guy he used to be. But one truth still won't budge. This life right now was a total nightmare, nothing fit. Everything fought him, and it felt nothing like the world he used to have. No one had combustion engines, and the village was so short on horses and fertilizer that it could barely keep going. Each day, the villagers got dragged into non-stop labor just to keep breathing. And even at just 8 years old, Ash was already tough enough to handle the work. Even all the memories from his past life felt like they belonged to some far-off dream, untouchable, unreal. He finally got it. If he stopped working, hunger would eat him alive. And yeah, this new world was weirdly fun too. And it was brutally demanding. Yet in his desperate mess, Ash finally felt like he'd stumbled onto pure entertainment. He finally understood that if he wanted to truly savor what was inside books, he had to learn to read at lightning speed. After bowing to his parents, he bolted into the house, itching to drill the words Foka had taught him. He stumbled at first, but knowing they were written in a phonetic alphabet kept him going as he kept reading until his eyes finally drooped and he crashed asleep. Later, his mother scooped him up and tucked him into bed, murmuring that Ash had been totally locked in on letters all day, like he couldn't get enough of learning. Ash's father shoved an idea at her, tell him books were useless, and as a man he should stick to tilling the fields instead. But her mother shot back, saying sure, fieldwork mattered, yet reading was just as valuable. She couldn't stop smiling at the idea of Ash actually enjoying himself later, just from reading. After the fight, Ash bolted back to Folka and begged for another book. Folka leaned in and asked if Ash had finally gotten bored of reading. Ash grinned and said it'd take him only a month to memorize every single letter. Folka couldn't believe it. He blurted that there's no way anyone could learn letters that fast. Ash shot back that he'd already mastered them, so he was only asking for a new book. Folka didn't buy it for a second. She told Ash to at least come up with a lie that sounded believable. Frustrated, Ash fired off, "What would FOCA say if I really had memorized every single letter?" And FOCA shot back that it was next to impossible. Then Ash leaned in and proposed, if he could really remember every last letter, then Folka should let him borrow any book right under her watch. Mocha agreed to the deal, but she didn't give Ash a free pass. First, he had to prove he'd memorized the letters. Ash fired off the question how was he supposed to prove it and demanded a pen and paper on the spot, while Folka stared and asked what on earth he planned to do with them. Ash shot back that he was getting ready to draw up a contract. He dropped the fact that Folka would actually hand him a book as payment for being called a liar, and he shot back, asking if Folka really thought that was a smart move. Folka couldn't believe Ash was taking it this far, but Ash snapped back that sure, her refusing his book request made sense, yet calling him a liar demanded an apology, because it crushed him, and he even played the part by pretending to be mad and feigning tears. Folka noticed Ash didn't look hurt in the slightest, but she still thrust the pen and paper into his hands. Ash took the paper like it weighed nothing, then admitted he wasn't used to quill pens and confessed his handwriting was absolute trash. The moment Folka finished the contract, he snatched the paper and stared. Ash really had memorized every single letter within just a month. He demanded to know how Ash pulled off something that big, because Ash couldn't even read properly before. Ash told them he had memorized that first sentence, then ripped letters out of it like a codebreaker to crack everything else, filling in the unknown ones as he went. He was convinced this whole process crushed the doubt and proved his claim beyond a shadow of a doubt. For his next book, Ash demanded either a holy scripture or a super simple storybook he could breeze through. He grabbed the books and hauled them home, where his mum cheered him on and backed his reading habit while his dad snapped and scolded him for it. Still, Ash didn't slow down a bit. He kept reading hard, and later even snagged more books to keep the momentum going. As winter crept closer, Ash snapped that the cold was getting worse by the day, and everyone agreed. Then they spotted the stack of books in his arms. "Do you really need all that?" they asked. Ash just smirked and said, "I've already read them. I'll bring them back as soon as I'm done." Folka couldn't believe it. Ash tore through those books so fast, then somehow even taught himself how to write. He was absolutely blown away, watching Ash like he was something far bigger than an ordinary kid. Falk grabbed Ash's attention and told him to sit down, then leaned in and said he needed to talk about something important. Curious as heck, Ash nodded and sat down. Then the people shoved a book in his hands, clocked how sharp he was, and told him to read it right away, calling it a special volume. Ash hesitated with a clenched breath, staring at the book's pages. Those letters looked nothing like the rest, crisp, tidy, and way too organized. Folk asked if Ash could actually read it, and Ash confessed he was scared as some of the letters looked totally foreign to him, so he blurted out, "What is this book even about?" Folka leaned in and said the book wasn't just any story. It was a copied manuscript from some ancient civilization. When Ash heard that, his vibe instantly turned uneasy, and Folka leaned in, asking if he'd ever studied ancient civilizations before. Ash said he'd heard the rumors, but deep down he still wasn't sure they were real. "He told me these civilizations were wrapped in legend," then leaned in and demanded to know if the manuscript really came from that age. Folka finally confirmed the manuscript truly came from an ancient civilization, then admitted he'd been wrestling with that book for ages, digging through clues and researching from the royal capital to crack it open. And even after running everything by scholars and top experts in the field, even after dumping massive money into it and grinding on the manuscript every single day, he barely moved a page forward. He failed to deliver the results they demanded, so they shipped him off to a remote village. Yet even after the transfer, he kept grinding on his manuscript. Ash couldn't stop wondering why Folker was so completely obsessed with ancient civilizations. Foki admitted he couldn't fully pin down why he was so obsessed, but he had a gut feeling his curiosity matched Ash's perfectly. Even with all those crushing problems, they both nodded and swore they'd keep chasing the truth no matter what. As they huddled over the manuscript, Ash blurted that he couldn't believe something like this actually existed because he'd always thought it was just a made-up fairy tale. Folk leaned in and said, "Yeah, some legends about those ancient civilizations could be myths, but the manuscript's details proved the truth. Those civilizations really lived." Ash leaned in and demanded to know if the fabled tech from those ancient civilizations was real or just a myth. Folk admitted you can't ever know for sure, but he still held on to hope like it was his last lifeline. Ash stared in awe at the thought of a world where advanced tech could rewrite everyday life like food and clothing, that could adapt and change everything. Medicines that blasted healing into motion, plus lamps that shone like they had their own heartbeat, burning bright without a single spark of fire. And they raised buildings using mind-blowing, ultra-advanced techniques. He couldn't shake the feeling that the life he'd only ever fantasized about might have actually lived inside those ancient civilizations. By cracking the ancient language and prying open its secrets, he dreamed of bringing back the bright, thriving life he once knew in his past life. While Ash couldn't shake the thought that ancient civilizations might have really existed, he dug up a bunch of books that didn't treat them like fairy tales, but like real legends built on facts and painted civilizations packed with insane, world-shaking advancements. The longer he thought about it, the more it felt like they really could have once thrived. He stared at the truth like it was cruel if they could crack those ancient societies by finally understanding their forgotten language. Then maybe the riches and wisdom they lost could be found again too, and honestly, the thought was so unreal, it almost didn't feel real to him. Like that prosperity and progress could truly come back from. Ash leaned in and told Folker he had to dig deeper into the ancient civilization to learn what the world was hiding, and Folker just shook her head, questioning how dependable Ash really was. And as he remembered Ash saying some letters looked alike back then, just a theory, now proven, he laid it out. Researchers agreed ancient civilizations could be sorted into just two types. Early on, late on, Folker swears the symbols the first civilizations used didn't vanish. They got handed down to the later generations, and even some still live on today, but every time those writings were copied and passed along, the characters kept getting twisted, and a huge chunk of the original text disappeared. Ash finally got it. He'd been fighting a manuscript that people believed came from a super ancient civilization, and that's why so many of the words wouldn't ever click for him. He asked to dig into the manuscript even deeper, and the folk said yes, then demanded Ash shoot him a message the moment anything important popped up. As Ash kept reading, he realized huge chunks of the letters were gone, and the whole message turned into a jumbled mystery he could barely make out. The ancients left behind a mountain of unknown characters, and it hit him like a wave. He couldn't shake the fear that there might be no way to crack their meaning. While Ash was poring over the manuscript, one word slammed into his memory. It was the same symbol his father used to scratch into the ground. His dad had said it meant a job was finished. An ancient spell meant to strengthen the fields. Ash stared at the symbol and suddenly realized it could match the exact character he'd been seeing in that manuscript. He started theorizing that those letters might not be sounds at all. They could be carrying their own meanings, like ideograms with ideas built in. Ash leaned in to tell Folker his suspicions. The book's letters weren't real letters at all. They were pictures, and every image was packed with meaning. Folker looked completely stumped by that suggestion. Ash snapped back and explained that the characters were basically pictorial symbols, then urged them to try communicating that way. He pointed at Folker, and Folker instantly got it. Ash was telling him to do it. Ash jabbed a finger at himself, then mimed opening and shutting his mouth like he was talking. And right then, Folker finally started to get what Ash meant by pictorial characters. To prove his point, Ash scribbled the same exact symbol on a fresh sheet of paper. And then it hit. Folk realized Ash was talking about a picture code, and suddenly those character concepts clicked in his head. Ash nodded along, grabbed one of Folk's symbols and said it was him, and that those ancient words were packed with way more meaning. Folk latched onto the idea, practically buzzing, because it would totally explain why they'd run into so many wild, unforgettable characters. He said this breakthrough meant they'd uncovered at least 3 brand new characters. Ash nodded and guessed the ancients might have built their whole world on pictorial symbols. Folka stared at the crowd and realized somehow every single character fit like it was made to belong there. Together, and honestly, both of them worried that all this complexity might spell trouble. But Volker just shrugged and said it was only a gut feeling. Still, a wild thought hit him. Maybe they'd just stumbled onto something huge. Discovery hit the village like lightning. Folks seized Ash, eyes wide, and blurted out how huge this breakthrough could be. How their theory finally had a shot to prove itself, even as Volker visibly struggled to keep his hype from spilling over. Ash tried to calm him down, but Volker's excitement still blazed clear as day. Volker light up and praised Ash for his sharp insight, and the two kept firing off ideas about what their findings could change. Ash noticed Volker getting more and more obsessed with studying the ancient language, like she couldn't stop burning through it. Worried about him, Ash clocked that Fuka's non-stop sprint would burn him out. So he shadowed him while grabbing books because a quick check-in wasn't going to be enough to keep Fuka safe. Later, while Ash sat alone in his room, he stared at the grim truth of his village, how short life really was, how fear ruled every day, and how even a simple cold could snap someone's life away. That's when he understood he had to live like time was burning, squeezing every single day for all it was worth. So he threw himself back into motion and pushed on. Every single day he tore through books, burning with ambition to dig up the hidden riches of ancient civilizations. Even though he craved to reach them fast, he had to face the truth he didn't know where to find the knowledge he needed, and it hit him all at once. Finally, his dad, David, barked at him with pure anger and sarcasm, demanding to know if Ash would lend a hand or if he planned to get lazy from all that non-stop reading. David went straight into a heated lecture, and Ash snapped back by asking how David could possibly help. Then David told them that Quid, the merchant, had finally shown up with his goods and that they'd sell off their surplus wheat harvest. Hearing that, Ash froze in shock, because Quid's visit was here at last. When Quid finally showed up, David smirked and said it felt like no demons were going to ruin his run. Now Ash stepped in to greet him and clocked that the merchant looked dead, sure he could dodge every problem. Ash couldn't stop thinking about it. He'd been secretly questioning for ages what these so-called demons were really made of. Whether they were savage beasts, clever thieves, or something stranger, no one could give him a real answer, just childish guesses that left his curiosity gnawing. So David stepped in and showed Quid exactly what they planned to sell. Quid eyed the winter wheat, nodded at its great condition and tight packing, then offered 4 copper coins to buy the whole batch. David asked how much it came to in iron coins, and Quid shot back, 80. David nodded, agreed to the price, and immediately stocked up salt, the usual herbs, grinding stones, and fever reducers. Quid broke it down fast. That jar of salt was 12 iron coins, a bundle of herbs hit 15. The grinding stone cost 8, and the bottle of fever-reducing pills. Also 8 iron coins. While David sifted through the items, he spotted a strange jar and demanded answers. And Quid told him it was honey wine, priced at a whopping 20 iron coins. David asked for a discount, but Quid shrugged and basically said, "You'll buy it anyway." Ash pointed out that if they showed up empty-handed, their mother would be furious about it. Quid praised Ash's quick thinking, and Ash immediately shot back, asking if Quid could spare 2 more needles. Quid told him to hang tight, then explained the cloth was 10 iron coins, while the 2 extra needles would cost another 6. As Ash snatched the cloth, he grinned. Now they had everything they needed. David's eyes kept snapping back to that honey wine, so he asked for more. Quid leaned in and said, sure, he'd knock off a little. But David had to keep it quiet and not tell anyone else. David loved the deal, grabbed Quid's hand, and raved that he was the best merchant out there. Behind it all, Ash kept thinking about how many more times his father could poke the bear before their mother flipped out. Quid just smirked and told Ash the cut was nothing, only 4 copper coins, so there was 0 reason to worry. Ash made it clear he wasn't worried about the discount at all. He was worried about the prices. Quid shot back that even if he sold the same stuff in the city, it would cost more, so the discount made perfect sense. Ash then called out a huge miscalculation Quid had made. Quid snapped back, stunned. Wait, what do you mean? Ash watched Quid's math come out way too fast, then laid it out, ignoring the alcohol. The total was just 59 iron coins, meaning if winter wheat alone is worth 80. There should have been coins left over, even after paying the original alcohol price. Ash told them straight up, if Quid was trying to cheat them, Ash would have no choice but to drag the whole mess to the church, and once Priest Foka heard it, the entire village would know, wiping out Quid's business for good. Ash went on to say that even the best merchants can still slip up and make mistakes. He swore that Quid had always treated the village fairly and could be trusted with his eyes closed. And Ash backed it up. He wouldn't tell anyone, because it was just an honest slip, and humans mess up sometimes. He added that this wasn't the first time Jewel and Ban the Hunter had faced the same kind of trouble before. Ash brushed off the miscalculation and said that Quid's trust was earned for a reason, then pushed him to keep proving he deserved that reputation. Quinn shot him a grateful smile, then pressed a little token of thanks into his hands. He handed Ash a gorgeous piece of fine fabric and asked if Ash liked it. Ash took the gift in hand, convinced their deal was solid and sure that Quid would keep running as a trustworthy merchant, as long as the prices stayed fair. David urged Ash to move faster, and Ash nodded immediately, saying he was excited to team up with Quid again someday. Right after the deal, Ash rushed over to Foka and grilled him about whether he'd been eating properly. Foka shot back with a dry jab, teasing if Ash had just decided to become his wife. Ash flinched back, thrown off and utterly confused. Then Foka clarified that Ash's non-stop worry was way too much, making him look like a kid who couldn't stop hovering. Ash shot back that if a kid feels forced to worry about an adult, then that adult better wake up, look at his own actions, and start living up to the responsibilities he owes. Foka couldn't stop praising how slick Ash sounded, and then Ash leaned in, asking if he'd finally cracked any progress on those ancient texts, only for Foka to admit he hadn't deciphered much yet, though he had spotted a few names that kept showing up over and over in the manuscript. Ash's hope surged. He leaned in and tore through the papers Foka handed him, because Foka was like, if these names were carried down through the generations, they could be the key to cracking this text. Ash was pleased with how things were going, so he grabbed a few books and asked the locals if he could borrow them that very day. Foka nodded along, saying it was exactly what they'd agreed on, and Ash shot back that the whole deal came from an old custom. He grabbed a stack of storybooks, hunted down general education books to level up the village, and with books cradled in his arms, he told Foka, "I'm headed to the cathedral." As Ash finally sank into a quiet corner, he couldn't stop thinking about how wild those travel diaries were packed with history. Yet he also noticed a ton of technical manuals and ancient smithing work preserved for ages. He couldn't stop staring at that botanical guide, wondering if it could actually help him learn everything about plants. Right then, a girl from the cathedral shoved the door open and beamed at Ash, greeting him warmly. She couldn't help thinking the girl was being hit with the same truth again. South is still just as strange as ever. A boy who stayed weirdly calm, like he'd already lived 1,000 lifetimes and aged way past his years. That's why her jaw dropped when she saw him burst out of the church with a grin, one smile she'd never ever seen on his face. That church was supposed to be a quiet spot for study. Father Folk kept pushing that idea, but she'd never once seen a soul reading inside, because everyone stayed locked into their own work. Still, South trekked to the church every single day to study, and it had her wondering, did he really love it, or was he just putting on a show? She despised studying with her whole soul and couldn't wrap her head around the idea that South might actually enjoy it. His real, genuine smile unsettled her so badly, she couldn't look away. Before she could even think, she swung the church door open, and there stood Ash, right in her face. Ash greeted Micah with a big, warm smile when she showed up. But Micah clocked the truth, he was still glued to his book, and she couldn't help asking if he'd only just started reading there. Yeah, he swore it was true, and then told me he'd snagged the book from Folka. Micah asked if he was really enjoying it, and Asher nodded, confirming it. Greed gnawed at him, and he demanded to know if she'd come to see Folka. When she said yes, he told her Folka was inside and asked if she wanted him to call him. Micah gave the nod, and Ash rushed to tell Folka she'd come to see him. Spoker, still the ultimate gentleman, leaned in and asked what on earth brought her here. Ash couldn't stop thinking about how wildly different Folka sounded when he talked to everyone else, because with Ash, it felt like a whole other person. Micah leaned in and asked Folka to teach her how to write. saying she'd been thinking about it for ages. Ash couldn't believe it. Micah, the mayor's daughter, showed up wanting to learn how to read and write. He stared at how basically nobody in his village could read or write except the mayor's family, and Klein himself, who could read, write, and calculate like it was second nature, the exact skills the village needed to run right. Ash figured Micah's hunger to learn sparked the moment he started showing up at church, and it lit the same fire in her, so she chased an education too. He even recalled how Iwaka, the mayor's wife, had sparked his love for books in the first place, set up late-night reading sessions that sparked hope in him, and pushed him to believe he could keep living. Without her pulling the strings, he couldn't stop wondering what kind of man he might have become. Father Folker promised Micah he'd back her in her studies, but warned that he wouldn't always be around because other duties could steal him away. He told her that Ash, same age as her, could read and write too, and said he'd be the perfect partner for her, and Ash froze, stunned, wondering why he'd been picked at all. Micah threw his agreement in. Folker snapped, "It's settled." And Ash's eyes widened. He couldn't help hoping someone would at least hear his opinion. Folker pushed Ash forward, calling him his best student, even while he was still scratching his head about what was happening. And Ash nodded, despite being just as confused. Folker then said he still had other business to handle and walked off, and Ash couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been dumped on the job as a trick to see if he could crack that ancient language. Micah clasped her hands in a desperate plea, and when Ash saw it, he instantly thought, if she can learn to read, I'll finally have someone to share my stories with, which he totally expected to be fun. So he said yes, grabbed a stack of books, and dove into their study session. He shoved Micah the book he'd begun with right away. It bragged that inside were the very scriptures priest Folker used to lead the festivals and ceremonies. Since Micah already knew a few of those scriptures, Ash figured this could supercharge her learning. Then he named the very first book she should open, pointed it out like it was crucial, and Micah leaned over to Ash and demanded, "What was the first word you ever learned?" Ash chanted the words, "O mighty wolf god, wise monkey god, fierce dragon god, grant us your power today," and then told them the lines were straight from the scriptures, like she already knew everyone would get it. Micah suggested they start right there, and Ash nodded, then leaned in and told her to repeat everything after him. Seeing Micah drifting in her own head, he snapped, urging her to lock in and focus. He jabbed at a spot in the book and told me that Shiki the wolf god was named there, then said people revered him for a body built like iron, praying to him when a baby was born, or when someone was out grinding with hard manual labor. Micah finally got what strong really meant, and Ash kept going, saying it didn't just mean power, it meant a steel resolve, the kind that lets you stay unbreakable. Micah nodded in agreement, and Ash pushed her to speak up any time. Doubt hit, ask questions, no hesitation, and if it got confusing, they'd team up and run it by Folker together. Micah then asked about the wise monkey god, and Ash said wise means smart. So when you study, you better pray to the monkey god and beg for wisdom. Micah got it instantly and pushed for them to go pray. And Ash agreed right away. He was so fired up by how fully Micah was locked in. He was thrilled they could keep studying, and not a shred of shame ever crossed his mind as he learned they huddled in prayer together, then dove right back into reading. Micah couldn't help but savor every second. When night rolled in, Folker showed up and said both of them looked wildly excited on day one. Then he frowned, pointed out how dark it was getting, and told them it was time to head home. Ash nodded along, but Micah glanced outside, said it was pitch black, and admitted she hated it. Ash heard her out and offered to walk her home, but Micah froze in surprise because their houses weren't even on the same side, and he still had to get home himself. Ash swore he wouldn't dare leave her alone when night fell. Folk warned that the dark can bite, and he pushed Ash to make sure Micah got home safe. Micah hesitated, but Ash leaned in and told her, "Don't stress, everything's going to be okay." As they headed out, Ash blurted out that sorry for the delay they'd taken to finish their study session. Micah shrugged and said it was totally okay, and then he cut himself off. She praised him non-stop for being amazing, and even though they were the same age, she couldn't believe how fast he was picking up letters and how much he already knew. Ash thought it had to be memories leaking in from a past life, but he had no clue what would happen if anyone found out about them. So he decided to keep it from her because he didn't want to look weird or turn his past memories into some giant, awkward spotlight. With those memories flashing in his mind, he pushed Micah to believe in herself, cheering that she could already read more words than before and that hit him as seriously impressive. Micah wanted to know if he was right, but she confessed she still hadn't nailed every single letter yet. Ash shot her a confident smile and said, "Keep studying like this, and you'll have them down in no time. You'll be totally fine." And Micah, buzzing with excitement, didn't even see the little stone in her path, nearly face-planting as she stumbled. The second Ash saw her trip, she snapped her hand around Micah's and demanded, "Are you okay?" Micah's cheeks flared as their hands brushed, and shyly quickly reassured him, "I'm fine." Ash realized the night was darker than he'd imagined, so he urged them to keep holding hands for safety. Then Micah, blushing hard, snapped, "Why?" Ash snapped, "Why, because it'd be a disaster if you got hurt." And then he went even softer, saying she was incredibly precious to him, and Micah blushed so hard her face almost caught fire. Ash leaned in and reassured her, "You're precious, seriously." Then he tilted his head, worried something was off. Because she was the mayor's family's only daughter, Micah leaned in and demanded to know what book Ash was clutching. He shot back that it was all about plants and trees. Then she asked, "Is it even fun?" And Ash grinned. It wasn't just interesting, it was genuinely helpful. He bragged that the book was a plant guide, sorting species into safe to eat and medicinal gems, packed with real, hands-on info about all kinds of vegetation. He helped them spot plants and trees that could boost their food and even beef up their medicine supply. And Micah buzzed with excitement, asking if that was actually real. Ash stared at the book like it was a goldmine, and he confirmed it was absolutely worth it. Then he broke down the details and explained that learning to read it wouldn't just be fun, it would teach you something valuable too. He told everyone the church had a bunch of other great books, and he was sure Micah would love them too, so Micah vowed to hit the books hard from that day on, and Ash pushed her to keep working with the same grit. When they finally made it to Micah's place, she thanked him for walking her back, so Ash yanked his hand away, waved it off like it was nothing, and told her to head home, promising he'd see her later. Micah agreed. Then as he spun to leave, a sharp pang hit her. How casually he let go of her hand made her wish they'd stayed holding on a little longer. Ash, convinced it was almost time to grab wild plants, hurried to the botanical guidebook to see what fascinating ones might be hiding out there. The very next day, right as Ash geared up for his outing, he noticed the sky was perfectly tuned for the job ahead. After studying the botanical guide like his life depended on it, he finally felt brave enough to go hunt wild plants, while the other kids stared at Ash like, "Why is he so fired up?" A girl urged the group to stay close, warning that bears had been spotted deep in the forest, and they'd better not push too far in. Micah hooked up with Ash and clocked his energy for the day. And Ash grinned back. He'd been deep in research with the guide. Ash nodded and told her he'd start by hunting down plants that matched what the guide showed. Then Micah leaned in, spotted a patch of grass, and asked, "You mean something like that?" Ash studied it for a second, then grinned and said it looked exactly like the one in the picture. Right as Jekyll closed in on Ash and Micah, he snatched Ash's hand and demanded, "Help me." Ash squinted ahead, spotted some prime plants, and told everyone to rush that way, remembering the ferns that had exploded there last year. Then someone else shouted for Jekyll to help out. Micah wished Ash good luck, then took off on her own. And Ash warned her to stay careful because Ash had just... Jekyll and that other boy kept going. And Ash noticed something wild ferns had sprouted everywhere over the past year. He lit up when he spotted a patch, and they dove in to gather the ferns. Then Ash pushed harder, insisting they grab other wild plants too, so he set off to hunt down every plant he'd seen in the botanical guide. While he was roaming around, Ash spotted a weird leaf that looked just like aloe, and his instincts screamed, "That's medicine." He figured it could heal wounds, calm stomach troubles, and fix nasty skin issues. Because in his past life, it had saved him over and over. Life, and the moment he realized it, hit him like something huge, but as he kept moving forward, he suddenly crumpled and blacked out. When Ash snapped awake, he realized he was totally alone in some stretch of forest he didn't recognize. He started marching into the forest, herbs on his mind, but sharp pain flared in his body. A pounding headache hit him, and then he saw blood. Panicking, wondering if he'd crashed into something. Ash blinked, baffled somehow he'd ended up in this mess, and he'd been wandering alone for way too long. He felt danger closing in, and he knew he had to fight his way back to the village. Ash locked onto his goals, helping Folka crack that ancient text, coaching Micah as she learned to read and write, and pushing himself to finish the book he'd been craving. He knew he had to get back to the village no matter what it cost him. Facing north, he spotted the road to the town, and when he spoke it out loud, his thoughts finally snapped into place. Now he felt sure he'd make it out alive. When Ash clocked that the sun was slipping away, he knew trying to head home in the dark would be way too risky, so he decided to hunker down and spend the night in the forest. He double-checked everything: his botanical guide, a spare coat, a hand towel, a knife, his backpack, plus flint and steel, and after counting it all, he realized he was pretty well set for whatever came next. At first, he realized he had to spark a fire before the sun fully vanished, and he immediately started hunting for water, because he knew he'd need to drink. While he kept hunting for herbs, he spotted an aloe plant in a place that felt way too familiar, like the exact spot where he'd lost consciousness before. He snatched a handful of aloe, and as he gathered it, he heard the rush of running water nearby, and when he followed it, he stumbled right onto a river. Ash eyed the water like it was pure gold, but he knew that even though it looked beautiful, drinking untreated forest water could wreck his health in an instant. He wished he had a pot to boil the water, but since he didn't, he swore he'd save it only for absolute last resort. Then he made up his mind he wasn't leaving and started hunting for sticks and leaves to spark a fire and keep warm through the night. He was determined to use the aloe to heal his wounds and the brutal injury to his head afterward. Once the fire finally caught, he dropped down nearby and soaked in the blazing warmth and dancing glow. He tucked some aloe into a leaf and pressed it onto his head wound. Then the pain crashed out almost instantly. Then he couldn't help wondering if that aloe's jelly would taste like a veggie or a sweet fruit, because people always swear wild raw plants can be insanely delicious and perfect for smashing that thirst. He recalled all the scraps he'd stumbled across, scrubbed them clean, and got them ready to cook. With flames roaring and food laid out, hope surged like he could actually pull through the night. With his stomach rumbling like thunder, Ash couldn't stop thinking about one thing: meat. He was praying a snake would show up, because the moment it did, he'd snatch it, slice it open, and drink its blood. By the firelight, he couldn't hold his eyes open anymore and finally drifted off into sleep. Next morning, he jolted awake, drained to the bone, and decided it was time to go harvest even more aloe. So he clung to the hope that if he couldn't escape the forest, the aloe's water might keep him alive, because even then, he still needed real drinking water to stay fueled and standing. Even though he knew aloe could heal skin and wounds, he also realized that going overboard with it could seriously backfire. He couldn't stop thinking, were there other plants packed with water, or could he somehow boil that river water too by following the guidebook? He stumbled on a paper pot idea, a cup of paper that's actually useful in a pinch, because it won't catch fire until the water inside starts boiling, and Ash's mind locked on it. If he could whip up that paper pot and wrap it with some leaves, it might survive the heat just long enough to boil the water. So he clenched his resolve and went to test it. He followed his plan, crafted the pot, boiled the river water until it was safe, and when he finally took a sip, pure relief hit him so hard he decided to make more. While he was hunting for his next meal, he spotted some fish and practically buzzed with excitement at the thought of devouring them. He steadied his basket for the catch, convinced fish would be safer to eat than plants, so long as he could have a fire going. After snagging 2 fish in his hands, he practically burst with excitement to cook them up. Gripping the fish with sticks, he shoved them right up by the fire and roasted them until they were golden. He figured that as long as he kept himself stocked with food and water, he could dodge starving to death. Food and water clutched in his hands, he finally exhaled, then decided to snag a bit more before heading back to the village the very next day. While the fish roasted, he bowed his head and prayed to God right like he always would. Right when he was about to dig in, he spotted someone creeping up behind him. The story snapped over to Folka. Yuka arrived with a box of food, then leaned in and demanded to know if it was enough. Folka dug through it, found it packed with exactly what they needed, and Yuka couldn't stop praising just how insanely helpful it was. And she pointed out that Folka had been caring for Micah lately because, as part of the village's head family, Micah needed to lock in on her studies. Yuka wondered if Folka's mood had finally brightened since Ash started showing up. Then Folka said Ash was easy to talk to. Right then, Micah burst into the room, sobbing and yelling her mother's name. She hit the ground on her knees, and right away Yuka snapped, asking why she was yelling like that and if she'd even finished picking the wild vegetables. Micah told everyone Ash never came back from the forest. Yuka demanded more, and Micah leaned in and explained that Jekyll was the first one to spot Ash was gone. While everyone else was guessing Ash might still be out there in the woods and urging them to look harder, Micah snapped at the idea he was terrified of what could be lurking, like bears nearby, so they turned back at once to head for the village and warn the adults. Micah looked terrified, frozen in indecision, because what if Ash got attacked by a bear? Yuka wrapped her in a tight hug, swearing everything would be okay and promising that the whole village would tear through the streets to find Ash. Micah kept sobbing, terrified he'd never get found. Sobbing roared louder, and Folka snapped at her that crying non-stop was getting her nowhere. He leaned in and warned her, "Save your tears if you burn them all now. There won't be a single one left when Ash comes back." He reassured her that Ash would absolutely come back and swore no bear in the world could touch that demonic boy. Then the Reaper snatched Folka, forced him to stamp a strange contract, and shoved him back home. Folka prayed Micah would hold back her tears until Ash finally came back. She believed tears were a deadly weapon women could unleash, and she fully intended to drown Ash in them. 3 days later, Ash came back, but the villagers were still crushed by grief, and even Folka felt the situation crush down on her. Then the search got shut down, and it was hard to picture a child in that much distress still staying safe. Yuka told Folka that every villager had shown up, and now it was time. Ash's funeral couldn't wait. Folka leaned in and demanded to know if she was really sure, because Ash's death still hadn't been confirmed. Yuka admitted she had the same doubts, but even after they tore the whole world apart searching, they still couldn't find Ash. Ash people said he could hold the funeral on his own if he had to, even though he kept thinking, "What if I come back and everything's gone wrong?" Yuka shot back that if he returned, it'd be totally fine. But she begged Folka to keep his real feelings buried, especially from Ash's parents, who were already fighting hard just to get by. Folka struggled with the choice, but deep down he refused to believe Ash was really gone. He was so sure that Ash would pull straight from everything he'd learned in those books and use it to survive. Staring at Ash's reading streak, he couldn't help wondering when Ash would finally come knocking for the very next book. He leaned in and told Yuka to wait a little longer. Yuka leaned in and asked, "So what's your real reason for wanting to wait?" Right then, Ash showed up, hanging back and asking, "Why are you all here?" And the crowd's shock hit like a wave the moment they saw him. Ash's parents, bursting with emotion, came charging in and wrapped him in the tightest hug. Sheila threw a thankful prayer to God the moment Asher came back, and David admitted how Asher's disappearance had terrified everyone. Ash, still rattled by the chaos, spotted everyone staring and whispering his name, so he blurted out what was happening and what they'd been plotting. Folky admitted he was seconds away from starting Ash's funeral. Ash stared in shock, blurting out why Folka would drop something like that on him. His face twisting with distress, though. In his mind, he couldn't shake that it had only been 3 days. Folk burst into laughter at his comment, and Ash's mother's calm slipped for a second before she forced it back. Micah slid up to Ash and demanded to know was he really himself, or just pretending. Ash checked that he was safe and back, even with exhaustion dragging him down. Then Micah just started bawling, couldn't hold it together. They blasted him as an idiot, and practically exhaled in relief once he came back. Even through tears streaming down her face, she kept crying so stunned with joy that it felt like her heart couldn't believe he was really back. Ash rushed to apologize for the stress he caused, and then, eyes wide, he finally breathed a sigh of relief, knowing he was safe. The villagers cheered Ash for his courage and demanded to know how on earth he'd managed to stay alive through the last 3 days. Ash started telling his story right when he was seconds away from digging into some fish. A man suddenly showed up, and to his shock, it was Ban. Ban sat beside Ash, and when Ash offered him a piece of fish, Ban refused with a quick shake of his head, so Ash just stared, shocked at how unnaturally quiet Ban was. He couldn't help but think how Ban was the only hunter in their village brave enough to slip into the woods alone, cutting through the wilderness like he was born for it. People knew Ban for his straight shooting, blunt attitude, so even kids and adults couldn't help feeling a little intimidated by him. Seeing Ash's dark, somber face, Ban snapped, "What's wrong?" Ash swallowed his pride, apologized, and admitted it felt totally strange being alone in a place like this. And because things had turned into a full-on emergency, he demanded Ban take him back to the village. Ban nodded in agreement, and Ash shot him a grateful smile, finally exhaling, then dove right back into the fish, knowing he could head home safe and sound. As Ash chatted with Ban, he clocked it. Ban was clearly in a rush. Ban shoved him back toward the village, and with Ban's help, Ash finally made it there. Ash kept talking, saying everything went sideways with a brutal run of events. But somehow he still crushed that wild herb gathering, and the real MVP was the aloe. Micah and Yuka shot Ash with a deadly glare, and the unease hit him like a cold wave. Ash bowed hard and apologized for dragging everyone into trouble, while Yuka blurted out how terrified everyone had been for him, and Micah quickly chimed in that she'd been scared too. Ash stayed cool and told them he was back safe, and instead of relief, they erupted shouting at him for acting so calm, like his steadiness didn't match the chaos inside them. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and someone joked that Ash wouldn't really die even if they had to kill him. Ash snapped back, stunned anyone could even believe that, and made it crystal clear if they killed him, he'd die for real. Just a few days after Ash came back, he replayed what happened with Jekyll, seeing those furious adults berate him. Since Jekyll had tagged along during that crazy wild herb hunt, turns out Jekyll had shoved Ash off a tree as a prank, and that stunt left Ash marooned in the forest. Ban later stormed into the forest, knelt to study the footprints right at the scene, and nailed Jekyll as the culprit. So with Ash safely back in the village, he didn't let the whole thing rattle him too much. He caught himself and realized that stacking up endless pranks could land you in real trouble. So he warned Jekyll to think hard before trying anything like that again. At first, Ash thought the villagers were blowing it out of proportion with his funeral, but then it hit him. If the same stunt happened to someone else, they might not have made it out alive. On top of everything else, meeting Ban turned out to be pure gold, an experience he'd never forget. Ban was a ruthless hunter. He fed the whole village with wild game and kept the dangerous beasts off their doorstep. And Ash couldn't believe it. Ban didn't just handle aloe and other wild plants. He also knew the perfect places to gather them. Ash realized Ban knew wild plants in ways books never could, and with Ban in his corner, he felt ready to sharpen his botanical skills, speed up his research, and invent stronger foods and medicines for the village. He strode up to Ban and begged to be his apprentice, and Ban nodded yes, so they sealed it with a fierce handshake. Ash's thanks burst out as he stepped in as Ban's official apprentice. Yeah, after that chaos, Ash's life snapped back into a normal pace. He jumped in to help Ban and kept right on going, continuing. He plunged into his botanical research, starting with aloe. He used it to stitch himself up while he was stranded in the forest, and it still worked just like it did in his old life. Same perfect results, and the fact he could grab it any time let him experiment without ever panicking about running out. Ash snatched a rat from a box that had been clawing to get out. When he checked the spot where he'd rubbed the aloe, he realized, shockingly, it was healing way faster than anyone expected. He decided aloe was basically perfect as an ointment, and then couldn't stop wondering what other wild uses it might have. He kept staring at the rat's every move, and the spot where the aloe landed looked primed to break out in a rash. So he figured the aloe's sting or soothing power must swing based on how much got used and how long it stayed. As he pushed through his tests and experiments, his workspace started to evolve fast, and it hit him. Paper, a quill pen, and ink weren't optional anymore. They were the lifeblood of his research. Ash marched up to Quid to bargain for the supplies, and when Quid demanded to know what he needed, Ash shot back that he wanted a pen and paper. Quid nodded and handed them over afterward. Ash looked back at how he'd come to Quid before and realized Quid had been acting nervous. It hit him hard. Quid knew he was broke, slid the bill onto his own tab, and that meant Ash would have to cough up that debt sooner or later. Meanwhile, Ginny the rat had turned into Ash's go-to partner for his experiments, and he couldn't run them without her. Ginny wasn't a pet at all, but it still became the key test subject for checking how different medicines really worked. Ash knew the future would demand even more experiments, and he couldn't afford to dodge a single test they needed. He kept wondering if anyone would think he felt bad for using rats in his experiments, but the truth was he didn't feel a thing in his eyes. Those little rodents were nothing more than pests. In a world where everyone's fighting hunger day and night, those nasty, crop-gobbling rodents had to be tested fast because one crucial experiment might finally change everything. He didn't hesitate to shove them into brutal conditions and drown them in too much medicine. So deep was his hatred that he barely felt their pain anymore. Through his experiments with Ginny, Ash finally cracked the code on aloe, and the results thrilled him, because aloe packed an insane range of uplifting effects. Then he had to find out if those amazing effects would hit humans the same way. So he didn't wait around. He decided to start testing on himself. With aloe's curative powers in mind, he smeared aloe's salve on his hand and held his breath, waiting for the cure to kick in. It blew his mind how much everything changed. That salve soaked into his hand and visibly erased the cracks and hangnails, and he could barely process just how much better everything looked. Ash felt thrilled watching aloe work wonders on human skin, even though he'd already tested it on guinea pigs first. Right then, Sheila, his mum, burst in and demanded his help hauling water. Ash nodded and took the bucket from her hands, and she smiled like she could finally breathe easier. She blinked in shock. One of Ash's hands was suddenly clean and smooth, like it had been polished, not wrecked like before. Ash told Sheila he'd been testing aloe as a topical ointment, and he couldn't stop smiling at how well it worked. Then Sheila gasped, stunned, asking if there really was an ointment that could make skin feel that smooth and silky. She asked if he had any left, and Ash nodded yeah. He had some and told her he was going to whip up more once he finished. Sheila grabbed his hand and asked, straight to the point, if she could use the ointment. Ash nodded and said yes. He cautioned her, yeah, it worked for him, but it could mess with other people's skin. If she felt even a sting or an itch, he told her to ditch it right away. She nodded fast and asked if she could start using it immediately. Ash shoved the ointment into her hands and she rubbed it in while whispering that it felt unreal. Then she prayed it would leave her hands as smooth as his and thanked him with real gratitude. Ash stared in disbelief as Sheila praised the ointment like it was magic, and then he swore to himself to whip up an even bigger batch for her. He started wondering if the village would want it too. Not only women, but men and kids as well, and he couldn't miss how many villagers had rough, calloused hands. And he prayed that even something this simple could finally level up their lives. Ash discovered that the aloe salve worked like magic, and before long, his mother's rough hands had smoothed out and healed. He realized those positive results pulled in way more attention than he ever expected then. When he finally met Micah, her eyes widened at how clean his hands looked, and she couldn't stop asking what medicine made his skin so smooth. Ash then pushed Micah and Yukia to try the salve too, admitting it was still a work in progress, but they didn't hesitate, eager to jump in and help right away. Ash felt sure that handing out the salve around town would seriously level up the villagers' lives. Then he watched how instantly everyone wanted it, and his mind snapped to a bigger idea. Maybe there was even more potential, and maybe they'd actually pay for it. Ash paced through his thoughts, wondering if he should try some test marketing around the city. And after digging into everything he'd learned from books, he decided he wasn't done yet. He'd hunt down even more answers. Micah spotted him, buried in a brutal book, slid up to him and asked, "Dang, what are you reading, and why is it so tough?" He flashed her the book's title and dared her to say it herself. She tried, nailed it on the first go, and called it the Livestock Manual, and Ash couldn't help but beam at how much her reading skills had skyrocketed. Micah was thrilled and fired off a question, "Does this manual cover livestock like horses and cows?" And Ash nodded, explaining that livestock meant animals you could raise and keep for different purposes. Then Micah pushed again, asking about meat production, and Ash confirmed the manual had that too. He said that if the aloe salve actually worked, he'd use the profits to kick off something brand new in the village. But his research had warned him raising livestock was brutal and demanded serious money up front. He had to line up animal husbandry expertise, proper stables, a starting breeding pair, and a mountain of costs he couldn't ignore. Even though raising chickens was pretty manageable, Ash couldn't ignore the truth. Those clucks could lure wolves and demons straight out of the forest, turning life in the isolated farming village into a constant battle. His research also proved it. Demons weren't just some feral danger like wolves, they were something totally different. From what Ash could piece together, old folklore swore that a demon raid once wiped out an ancient civilization, and now his mind wouldn't stop racing, begging to know what demons really looked like and what kind of terrifying trouble they could unleash. He leaned in and told Micah to lock in on iron farming tools, or grab whatever else could actually help, because he was still wrestling with his choices. Micah burst out, "I'm amazing," and he tried to play it cool, saying he hadn't really done anything big yet. Then she shot back that he was wrong, raving that the aloe salve had her hands looking spotless and feeling unbelievably clean. Ash stared at her hands and found nothing, no rash, no swelling, no bad reaction at all. With a grin, he leaned in and asked Micah how the salve made her feel, if it burned or itched at all. And when he watched her closely, Micah suddenly felt something strange creep over her hand. Ash yanked his hand back fast, then blurted out an apology, realizing he'd crossed a line and committed a serious etiquette breach by touching her. Micah shot him a steady look and reassured him everything was okay. No need to stress. Ash thought with total certainty that even though she was young, she still deserved the absolute respect. No shortcuts, no disrespect. Mika swore she felt zero pain or itchiness and admitted the salva had totally turned her skin silky smooth. News hit the air and Ash lit up, saying it was nothing but good news, since Yukiya hadn't run into a single problem with the salve either. Micah then chimed in that her mother was thrilled to the core with the results. Ash lit up at the idea and pushed, "Let's start studying." Micah nodded instantly, and the two of them dove right back into their lessons. Meanwhile, Yukiya couldn't believe what Ash had just cooked up, a brand new kind of medicine. She realized he'd basically cracked the technology of ancient civilizations stuff. The church only lets its researchers in the capital touch. Nothing like some random local temple could ever pull off. Temple, she could barely wrap her head around it. Ash had pulled off all of this, and it felt like some cruel, elaborate prank. But that salve hit like a miracle. Its effects were real, no doubt about it. The villagers had never owned anything special before, but now they were holding a brand new item no one in the capital had even dreamed of. They'd always squeezed every last drop out of their tiny, limited resources, praying they could carve out a legacy for the next generation. Then, out of nowhere, they stumbled onto an unbelievable new resource, and it was just as baffling as it was powerful. That medicine was practically a flare in the dark, sure to pull in anyone who couldn't stand Ash's unbelievable victory. Yukiya snapped to it. If she didn't step in, Ash and the villagers would be crushed. She cooked up a dinner plan to pull Ash over, talk through the medicine, and decide what steps they had to take next. She also wanted to suss out Ash's real intentions and figure out if this breakthrough could flip the village's fate for good. When Ash finally reached Yukiya's place, he couldn't wrap his head around it. He was getting invited for dinner as a thank you for the aloe salva. He pounded on the door, greeted everyone with a loud "good evening," and Micah swung it open, welcoming him with open arms. Ash thanked her for the invitation, then couldn't help but tell her she looked even more stunning than usual, because that dress fit her perfectly. She thanked him for the compliment, matched his energy right back, and told him Ash looked just as good. Ash thanked her again, and couldn't shake the feeling that Micah's non-stop work greeting every guest and guiding them inside was draining him. Even if he was just an ordinary visitor, he remembered his own parents running on nerves at home, even demanding he put on his nicest clothes. They closed in on Ash, praised him like he was the very picture of a gentleman, and Ash practically felt honored that someone would say that to his face. Yukiya swung the door open and urged him to kick back like it was his own place. And Klein the chief himself welcomed Ash with open arms too. While Ash, Klein, and Micah slid into their seats, Yukiya stood nearby and snapped that dinner was officially starting. Now that their guest was there, Ash practically glowed, ready to dig in. Yukiya practically urged him, "Eat before it turns cold." And once he nodded, he tucked in carefully, like he didn't dare waste a single bite. Ash jumped in right away, and Yukiya had to comment on his spotless table manners and pure gentleman vibe. Ash shrugged it off and said everyone there looked just as neat, so he was only copying them. Then he admitted he's not usually this meticulous, but he slipped for a moment and lost control. He gushed over the meal, praising Yuki's cooking while straight up envying her husband. And then, when it hit him, he was way too young to say something like that. Embarrassment crashed over him in an instant. Flattered by the praise, Yukiya leaned in and asked Klein if he'd heard what Ash said. While Ash, secretly seething with envy, realized Yukiya was still the most elegant, refined woman in the whole village. Village life finally clicked for Ash. Yukiya's elegance made perfect sense because she never grew up there. She was born and raised in the capital, the daughter of a powerful, influential family. When Klein headed to the capital to kick off his apprenticeship, he and Yukiya collided headfirst into a love so intense it felt like fate. Ash had taken her hand and claimed her in marriage. But honestly, all the heroic stories swirling around their romance were rumors to him. He'd never gotten the full truth. After dinner, Ash turned to Yukiya and thanked him for the amazing meal, thrilled he'd enjoyed it, and then their moment kept unfolding. And Asha told her she could ask whatever she wanted, because he'd be more than happy to answer her questions. Yukiya said her questions were about the aloe salve, then admitted she'd heard he might try selling it through Ash nodded and said, "Yeah." Back then, he was still only weighing the idea. Right now, Yukia couldn't shake the worry that kept creeping in. She was sure the medicine would fly off the shelves and rake in real profits for Ash's family, but it still scared her if he got too noticeable. The villagers might turn on him, and Ash said that a brutal gap in wealth could absolutely spark discord among. Yukia brought it up. Micah always bragged about Ash's sharp vocabulary, and then he pressed, "Did you learn it from some fancy teacher?" Asher nodded and admitted he'd been Fulka's top disciple, even though deep down he thought Fulka had barely taught him a thing. It was the perfect get-out-of-trouble excuse for moments just like this. Yukia shot Fulka a confident grin, saying Ash's wins would make her proud, and admitting that every bit of Ash's learning had turned their whole talk way smoother. After talking things through with Klein, she said Ash's intentions were solid, but warned them to team up on a plan, so nothing else blows up down the line. Ash thanked her for the help, admitting he'd almost dragged serious trouble straight into the village. He finally clocked that his plan missed the bigger picture, admitting he never meant to blow money on himself. But he knew he still had to gather a huge pile of cash and feared the villagers would get jealous if he did. He realized buying fresh supplies for the village would drain his pockets, so he'd have to grind and save, yet saving itself could stir up trouble too, and that's when he started wrestling with the best move to make. Micah suddenly blurted, "Yukia, stop!" As Yukia was bullying Ash, and Ash shot back that Yukia wasn't hurting him at all, he was just being weirdly kind. With a teasing smirk and a spark of trouble in her eyes, Yukia leaned in and dared Micah to defy her own mother. That smile hit like a secret weapon, sweet, irresistible, and straight up making her glow. Micah snapped back that if Yukia wanted to be cruel to Ash, she'd make Yukia pay for it, no matter that Yukia was her mother. Yukia bristled with curiosity, wondering why Micah was so fiercely protective and whether Ash was the reason she'd been targeted. Ash finally got it. If Yukia hadn't stepped in, he could have blown up his bond with the villagers, and he couldn't ignore the truth Yukia was calling out. Mika swore it was true, saying Ash was stacking money for the village to buy livestock and farming tools, grinding every day to figure out what would help everyone most. Then, Yukia just stared in shock at the revelation. Micah doubled down and praised Ash again, saying he always kept the village in his mind and that he was the real deal. A genuinely good person. With a sly grin, Yukia leaned in and asked Ash if he was also super handsome and just as lovely. Micah practically screamed back, "Yes," in pure excitement. Ash nearly choked on his words when that bold compliment hit. Then heat surged up his face and he blushed hard. Seeing that, Micah's cheeks flared red, and Klein lifted her up with a careful, gentle touch. Ash then pressed Yukia, asking if they were all just putting on an act. But Yukia shot that down fast, saying Micah was simply adorable whenever she reacted like that. Yukia sat down with Ash right then, pressed him about his plan, and demanded to know if he really meant to use the profits from the medicine, just like he'd promised. Ash nodded and said, "Yeah, village life is brutally tough, and he wants to cut those hardships down as much as he can." Yukia finally got why Ash needed livestock and tools, but he couldn't shake the question, could buying from Quid really fix their food problems? Ash could tell that kind of relief would hit him, and maybe his family too, but it wouldn't be nearly enough. Not when he still remembered the wild splendor he'd seen in his past life. His current stash felt way too small, but he didn't need the absolute best. He just wanted to set a baseline that everyone else had been missing. Ash realized that chasing a goal like this felt straight out of a fantasy, and it might be too big to ever reach in his lifetime. Still, he refused to let that dream stay out of reach. He craved even a sliver of it coming true, and he knew he'd have to lean on society to make it happen. If he couldn't pull it off by himself, he'd rally 100 people, then add more if he had to, and to make his vision real, he'd need supplies for 10,000. Even if the dream looked unreachable, he refused to back down. He kept chasing it. He told Yukia he wouldn't be satisfied just by making life easier for his own family. Everyone's happiness mattered to him, and he wasn't trying to play the hero or pose as some saint. Yet he was still dead set on making everyone else happy too. Yukia couldn't stop wondering what luxuries he meant, and Ash leaned in and told him the truth. He had a dream, not some wild fantasy one, just an ordinary wish. He wanted a life straight out of books, rich and comfortable, packed with conveniences. It felt like those legendary ancient civilizations, and yet he couldn't stop craving the modern comforts, imagining how amazing it would be to have them, until he finally realized he didn't even know the details, like he couldn't just dream up the designs or applications on his own. Turning these innovations into reality felt wildly out of reach, and he knew he'd need a whole crew of capable collaborators to pull it off. He still remembered Yukiya's earlier offer to help, and this time he finally took her up on it. With that kind of support behind him, he could finally keep chasing his huge dream steady, focused, and not slowing down. Since he was donating the proceeds to the village, he told Yukiya to jump in and help him hammer out his business plan for the aloe salvo. Yukiya said Mika didn't even come close. He was far more intriguing than he'd described, but yeah, a little intimidating too. Ash jumped in to apologize for his odd vibe, then promised her he wasn't some wolf in sheep's clothing, just a shy kid with honest intentions. Yukiya lit up and told them she was truly grateful, honored to help craft the business plan for something this generous, and absolutely thrilled to lend her support. Help as their hands met, Ash flashed a grateful grin, telling her how much it meant to have her support and how thrilled he was to get her help. Now that his case was finally laid before the village chief's family, he expected everything to go smoother, and he was betting hard on using their city ties to pull strings. Ash decided he'd hand Yukiya his salve recipe and step back from sales and distribution, happy to settle for a small profit as long as it meant the village's life got better. That was his first real leap toward his goal. He locked in, devoured books day after day, and pushed forward one step at a time until the life he dreamed of finally became his. The very next afternoon, Ash showed up at Yukiya's doorstep to hand over the salve recipe they'd been talking about. She thanked him, grinning because she'd been dying to try it, then tore into the instructions and realized this was way more complicated than she expected. But she was sure she could pull it off if she got the right ingredients, and Ash made sure to tell her to let him know the moment she finally brewed a batch. Then he shoved a pile of ingredients into her hands and told her, "I grabbed these on my last trip to the forest with Ban." He admitted he didn't know the first thing about business, so he'd put it all in her capable hands, selling and pricing the salve while he just asked for the absolute bare minimum cut from the profits. Yukiya demanded, "Are you sure about this?" because the medicine was his idea, and the thought of her taking the reins felt totally wrong to him. Ash told her he begged for her help because he couldn't juggle everything alone, and admitted there were tons of things he'd never think of by himself. He poured out trust in her skills and told her to take the lead, swearing he'd back her with everything he had. She nodded, then stepped outside her home with Ash. Yukiya said she'd start building a sales plan, and Ash lit up with gratitude for her taking charge. She also said she planned to whip up the salve a few times, just to figure out exactly how much her ingredients would actually make. Yukiya figured Mika looked genuinely ready to help, so she thought, let's get her involved. Ash nodded immediately, saying Mika could even read the recipe herself. Yukiya said Ash was the spark that helped Mika learn to read and write. But Ash shrugged it off and insisted it was Mika's own drive that pushed her forward. Yukiya found Ash crazy interesting, but then it clicked. He finally realized he still didn't fully understand why Mika was pushing so hard. She told her parents in the city that once she churned out enough salve, she'd ship it to them by courier, and then she leaned in and asked Ash what he thought. Action, he lit up and told her it was a brilliant idea, then ordered her to do it her way, so she nodded, took the job on herself, and promised to come back with updates as things moved. Ash thanked her, grinning, and told her he couldn't wait to hear all about it. He bowed, then strode out with full confidence that Yukiya could handle the aloe salve for now, so he shoved his thoughts toward bigger things, even eyeing the idea of researching a rodenticide to keep rats from tearing into the storehouse stock. As days rolled by, Yukiya sent Ash the good news her aloe salve was flying off the shelves, and sure enough, when the dust settled, his cut of the profits came to a full, shiny copper piece. Yukiya told them she'd started hawking that medicine in the capital's rich upper district, the same neighborhood her parents lived in, and now it had turned into a rare, ultra-exclusive treat with a brutal price. Ash couldn't believe it. His very first share was massive, because that one copper piece alone covered a full quarter of the year's winter wheat costs. Yukiya was running the whole thing and actually having fun, so Ash finally decided it was time to pay Quid back for that quill and paper. Only when Ash tried to hand the money over, Quid snapped it back and refused to take it, telling Ash to keep it and swearing he would never accept a single coin. Ash snapped to it, selling that salve cracked open doors to wealthy families, giving him a huge edge and a real shot at a booming business. And Quid straight up called it a win that proved Ash's hard work. Then Quid promised it was all because of him, and even said Ash could still count on Quid to keep showing up in the village, cementing a truly beautiful bond. Ash leaned in and told Folker flat out that he couldn't talk Quid into taking the money because if he carried it home, it would just end with his. Folker's father was using it to buy beer, so he demanded she grab it for him. Then Folker snapped back that even church business had limits, and holding that kind of money wasn't her job. Ash shot back that it should be called a donation, since Folker could pull it back any time, but Folker pushed back hard, more like a deposit than a donation, and admitted he was scared he'd end up holding onto it himself, wrestling with his own shaky morals. Ash clocked Folker's stiff clerical vibe and pitched a bold idea. If Folker couldn't keep the money, they could pool it into a joint research fund, so both benefit as long as it went toward ancient language studies, and Folker lit up, saying it actually sounded great, so Ash nodded hard, because he knew research costs can get brutal. At that exact moment, Micah slammed on the door and shouted, "Ash, are you in there?" because he'd heard his voice. Folker let her in and told Ash to team up with Micah on her studies. Then Ash pressed him. What did he really expect from this deal? Folker just smiled and said he trusted Ash to make it work. Ashley, Ash, and Micah stormed out of the room, and Ash couldn't stop himself from grumbling about how hopelessly hard it felt to focus, while Micah shot back with a grateful, heartfelt thanks. Her mum couldn't stop thinking about cranking out even more aloe salve because it was flying off the shelves. Yukiya even pitched the idea of getting other villagers involved. So Micah turned to Ash and asked what he thought. Ash said he didn't mind at all, as long as Tuji was okay. And Micah immediately promised to tell her mum that Ash had given the green light. Then they dropped into their seats to study, and Ash blurted out an apology for playing messenger. Micah waved it off instantly, saying she was just glad to help and truly appreciated the effort. After they finished their study session, Ash and Micah headed to Micah's place, only to find Yukiya and a few villagers already waiting there. Yukiya grabbed the spotlight and thanked everyone who helped kickstart the village's brand new industry. She rounded them up to whip up a batch of the aloe salve, walked them through the steps one more time, and they all nodded in agreement. Ash figured Yukiya made a smart move by ramping up production, because crafting that salve was a hands-on grind, and it definitely needed more workers. Yukiya ended up hiring the villagers who needed help the most. Widows and caregivers, nursing sick family members, women who couldn't handle heavy labor. With their brutal circumstances, the other villagers had no grounds to gripe about missing the hire. And Ash basically called it a genius move of smart management, because sure, Folker was an amazing scholar, but Yukiya ran the business like a pro. Manager first, they kicked off a practice session because none of the new recruits could read. They decided to hand out the recipe and teach literacy at the same time. Ash spotted Tanya and dove right into explaining how to safely pull the aloe spines, showing her the right moves step by step while warning her to stay extra careful. Tanya thanked him and he shot back, "Don't bring it up." Then he leaned in and asked, "Phil Tanya or just Tanya?" She grinned and said, "Tanya, everybody calls me that." Ash nodded along and told her, "If any step confuses you, grab help right away." Tanya finally confessed that she couldn't read at all, and the instructions kept tripping her up as she tried over and over to figure them out. And Ash promised her, right there, that he'd walk her through the recipe step by step, slow and clear, so she could read it with confidence as they went. Tanya agreed on the spot, and right away she caught Micah teaching another girl at the same time. Her curiosity sparked, so she pressed Ash on how he and Micah learned to read and write. Ash answered fast. They'd studied side by side at the church. Tanya tapped the recipe and demanded to know what those words meant. Ash shot back that the words laid out every step to whip up aloe salve, right down to what came next below, and then he walked her through step 1. First he yanked out the spines, and only after that he peeled the skin away, and kept pushing until she finally nailed the process. Yukiya genuinely respected everyone's effort, and with a little practice, he finally felt confident, sure that he could make the salve dependable every single time. That batch they whipped up that day was just a test, and Yukiya dared everyone to try it on themselves, saying it would wipe out blemishes for good. Scrub every blemish away until their skin turns unbelievably clear. All right, Tanya grabbed a small slice of the finished product and scrutinized it like her life depended on it. It hit her like a memory, something her mum used to make. Ash clocked her reaction and pressed her to explain, totally hooked on what her mum had cooked up. Tanya told me her mum used to make a special medicine that worked the same way. She'd smear it on wounds like an ointment, and rub it on rough, battered skin too. She figured it was a medicinal fix for stubborn skin, but when she tried it, she admitted it was basically the same kind of aloe salve. Ash leaned in and asked Tanya if she could still name the ingredients her mum used. Tanya remembered her mum didn't use honey at all. She swore by honeycomb instead. She explained that the honeycomb did the real work, while the honey got saved for cooking and other uses. And she even remembered her mum tossing extra ingredients into the mix, only she couldn't for the life of her remember what they were. Ash couldn't stop thinking, why would they use honeycomb? And what was it actually made of? The moment he finally realized he knew almost nothing about its composition, he just had to dig deeper. He guessed honeycomb could be just as valuable as honey, this wild, extra scrupulous creation the bees work overtime to make. He couldn't stop thinking, and the moment he wondered about the medicine's details, curiosity turned wild. He knew Tanya's mom might have explained it, but with both her parents gone, Yukiya had pulled Tanya in to help. Tanya's father was the village's only beekeeper, and when he died, her mother stepped in to tend the hives until the day she did too. They had ditched their kids Tanya and her younger brother Jiggle, two clueless troublemakers who knew basically nothing about their parents' line of work. Ash stared into the brutal cold of the farming village and feared the truth. Those old relics of ancient civilizations, their knowledge and techniques, would slowly vanish from memory, swept away like leaves in the wind. Tanya rushed out an apology for forgetting every detail, then admitted she wished she'd helped with beekeeping more. Ash immediately brushed it off, telling her she hadn't done anything wrong. Nope, he went on and on about how honey was crazy delicious and packed with nutrition, and that learning about honeycomb instantly lit a fire in him for beekeeping. Yukiya told Ash that beekeeping was the lifeblood of any farming village, and when he asked if she truly believed it, she shot back, absolutely. When Tanya told them her family raised bees, she explained they didn't just make honey, they churned it into candles too, and the whole village ate up the benefit, and Ash practically buzzed with excitement at the thought. Then they grilled Yukiya if they had enough cash to buy livestock. Could they also try their luck with beekeeping? Yukiya nodded fast, saying she'd been thinking the exact same thing. Ash told her the next move to lift everyone's life in the village was simple. He'd dive into beekeeping research, and Yukiya snapped back that he could count on her to help. Ash sighed and said the real snag was simple. The church had 0 beekeeping books, and he had to find one fast. Until then, he felt completely helpless. Like a kid with nothing to do, Yukiya chuckled that helpless was probably an overstatement, but they were still miles away from taking their very first step. As Tanya shot them a glance, she told Ash that her father owned a prized book. Its cover showed a honeybee, and it could be just what he needed. Ash stared in disbelief and demanded if it was really true. How could books exist beyond church walls? Then he immediately asked for permission to read them. Tanya nodded, and Ash shot back his thanks, practically pushing her to move. Then she hesitated, right on the edge of backing out. She admitted her house was an absolute disaster right now, and Ash told her, don't sweat it. But she still couldn't shake the worry. Eventually, he finally talked her into it. Then, right after, Yukiya and Micah showed up, and Yukiya snapped that Ash was pushing Tanya too hard and rattling her nerves. She urged them to delay the whole thing, and Micah immediately backed her up, so Ash nodded, admitted their worries, and suggested they take the book outside to read. Tanya asked where they should go outside, and Ash said, let's sit right there outside your house. Then Tanya noticed he practically buzzed with excitement just to start reading. Ash didn't hesitate. He confirmed it on the spot, and everyone was shocked by how badly Ash pushed. Then Ash leaned in and demanded to know if there was any other way, what he'd have to do to get Tanya's permission. With the promise that he'd do anything for that book, Tanya finally caved and handed it over. Right then, Ashley thanked her, slipped away from the others, and burst out of the house, practically yelling at Tanya to hurry. Memory, she begged him to slow down, and Micah trailed right behind them. Later, a woman remarked that she'd always seen Ash as calm, reserved, and quietly distant, and Yukiya nodded along, saying everyone else felt the same way. When they rolled up to Tanya's house, Ash and Micah hung back outside, while Tanya darted inside to grab the book. Then Ash dove in and started preaching practical beekeeping techniques. He dove headfirst into everything. Every kind of beekeeping honeybee, the perfect temperatures and active ranges, how to handle them, how to pull honey, keep the hive running strong, and finally how to process raw honey. He stared in shock, realizing the material went way deeper than he'd ever expected. Ash couldn't shake the thought that these techniques seemed to come from ancient civilizations from a far later era. It was wild that all that detailed knowledge survived for so long, even if people weren't quoting it in modern writing anymore, and he realized those careful explanations meant the book probably leaned hard on the expertise of later civilizations. Honestly, he couldn't even picture anyone in the modern era writing with that kind of razor-sharp precision, which made Ash's gut scream that this book was forged by a far later civilization, and to him it felt exactly like an archaeological relic ripped straight out of the past. And he couldn't believe it. How on earth could a relic this valuable be hiding in a tiny little village? Micah finally caught up, chimed in, and said, "We've talked bees enough for now." And Ash nodded along, admitting that the book was absolutely magnificent. And he realized he'd have to dig deeper, study every page, and catch every last detail, because once he'd finished reading, he was convinced this book could spark their beekeeping business. Tanya stared at the book and couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. Then she wondered if she'd be allowed to read it too. Ash blurted out how her dad had gotten his hands on that book, and Tanya leaned in and said her father told her it was a family heirloom. They say the whole bee farming legacy started because of this very book passed down through generations, though nobody knows how it first landed in the family's hands, and either way, the truth is brutal. This crew was once famous for beekeeping, even outside their village. The story swore that, over time, that book didn't just survive, it was sealed up like a priceless heirloom. Tanya said the account was passed down by word of mouth, so don't swallow it whole, take it with a grain of salt. Ash shot back that he trusted her family's story, and even guessed her ancestors must have been able to read the book, picking up those insanely advanced beekeeping techniques. Seeing that the book looked like it crawled out of a forgotten age, and that it was priceless all by itself, he grinned and said it wasn't even an exaggeration to call it a real treasure. Manager Tanya looked shaken by the whole assessment, then shrugged it off like it was just a book they'd kept at home. Yet she couldn't hide her shock that her family actually owned something this incredible. Ash nodded along, calling it a true heirloom, and swore Tanya's ancestors must have guarded it for generations just to make sure it survived to her. He couldn't stop wondering how many years that quiet, wise book had been sitting, untouched, in her family's hands. It looked like ages had gone by since the family last touched it, and still somehow that heirloom had never once slipped out of their hands. Even with everything crashing down on them, they pushed through and risked it all to guard a book they couldn't even read anymore, because while the descendants had drifted away from their ancestors' beekeeping know-how, that lost knowledge has finally been found again. Ash felt a steady, unshakable will hidden between the book's pages, and he couldn't help but marvel at how fiercely its authors fought to save their knowledge from the ravages of time. He told Tanya that this book was proof of everything her ancestors and parents fought to protect, so their beekeeping tricks would survive and thrive from generation to generation. Actions, he pushed her to carry that legacy forward, and Tanya couldn't help but wonder out loud if she could ever become a real beekeeper herself. She still wasn't sure she could follow the book, but Ash snapped in close, telling her he'd translate it all for her and that they'd learn the story together. She made the call to reclaim those lost skills, and it all came down to her. Tanya told them straight up that beekeeping had been her dream for ages. She told him she'd been admiring her parents' work since she was a kid, and she'd dreamed of stepping into their shoes ever since. Before she could even learn the lesson, her parents were gone, passed away before she could catch up. That book they left behind was way too brutal for her to wrap her head around alone, so she tossed the whole idea aside and went all in on just getting through each day. She declared she'd try again, fueled by sheer determination to honor her parents' legacy. Ash told her with total confidence that learning beekeeping would be his honor, using the same methods her ancestors had guarded for centuries. Memories flooded in, Tanya nodded with blazing enthusiasm, and Ash felt this heavy, perfect satisfaction settle in, finally knowing her family's brutal fight against the clock had paid off, and that priceless stash of knowledge, once moments from vanishing forever, now sat safely in capable hands. Ash leaned in and told Tanya that the hard work was coming in full force. He told me he'd have to race through the book just to figure out how to kick off beekeeping, especially since it was written in that old era, and he even said it could be a goldmine for his research into ancient languages. That's why he planned to march straight to Father Foka and have him inspected. Ash leaned in and asked Tanya point blank if she'd lend him the book, then let it stay at the church for now, telling her the priest there was a real archivist who could read it, and that Foka would be there too, making sure the book didn't slip into any more damage. Tanya said yes, but only because Ash swore he'd take care of the book. Then Ash leaned in and promised that anyone who even tried to mistreat it would pay the price, big time. Micah and Tanya both snapped into alarm and practically begged him to stop acting like that. Meanwhile, Jekyll crouched behind that tree, rage blazing at Ash for snatching Micah and his sister Tanya. With Micah at his side, Ash headed back and couldn't stop talking about how wild and unforgettable the day had been. Then he pushed the idea that they should take the book straight to the church and fired off a question: could Micah deliver a message to Ukiah for him? Micah nodded, and Ash fired off instructions: tell Ukiah they'll be starting beekeeping soon, Tanya will run the show, and that's all you need to say. Micah then asked if she'd read the book with him, and Ash jumped at the chance, admitting some parts were tough, but insisting they'd both have a great time digging into it together. Right then, Jekyll burst back onto the scene with two companions and shouted at Ash to come over. Ash bowed with a shaky apology and said he had to rush an important book to the church, promising he'd love to visit another time. Then he snapped his head to Micah and pushed her to hurry, because that book couldn't sit in the open air for long, right as Jekyll roared after them, accusing Ash of cowardice. Micah pushed, and Ash refused to bite back. Then asked if Ash really planned to let Jekyll talk to him like that, because Micah was ready to meet him head-on herself. Ash told her not to let it get to her and insisted they keep marching forward. He grabbed her hand and tugged her forward so fast that a hot blush instantly lit up her cheeks. That gesture lit a fuse in Jekyll. He snapped, screamed he was done for good, and then rocketed a stone straight at Ash. Ash slipped away from it with effortless speed, and Jekyll laughed at him, saying Ash only thought he mattered because he'd cooked up a skin medicine, then bragged that his next throw would never miss. Micah shouted that Jekyll had gone way too far, and Ash told her to grab the book and step back right now so she'd stay safe. She nodded and snatched the book from his hands. Then Ash surged forward to stare Jekyll down straight in the face, right as Jekyll pressed him, demanding to know if Ash had anything to say. Ash snapped that ruining the book would be treated like declaring war, then swore that if it happened, he'd unleash a no-holds-barred assault with every weapon and trick he had. Ash swore that the second Jekyll hurled another stone, he'd spend every waking second hunting him down and making him regret it. Terrified by Ash's fierce glare, Jekyll couldn't help but flinch. Then he turned to Micah and blurted if she'd been hurt, and Micah reassured him she was okay before thanking Ash for stepping in and protecting her, and she insisted she hadn't been hurt. And Ash just answered that he'd done what had to be done, then pushed her to keep moving. That night, Micah spilled every detail of what happened with Jekyll and his crew to her mom, how they'd been trading insults with Ash and even throwing stones, and the thing that hit her hardest was seeing Ash step in front of her, shielding her from the danger. Dread crept in, but Ukiah listened hard and clocked it. Micah's admiration for Ash was growing fast. Ash, Ukiah shot back, it won't be long before everyone starts clocking you because they're about to notice you everywhere, not just in. Micah's path would be shaped both for the good and the bad. She warned him that, down the road, he'd meet tons of people who hated Ash, just like Jekyll and his crew. Medicines aside, Ukiah couldn't stop praising Ash. She said he'd learned to read and write, cooked up brand new medicines, and pulled off feats so wild that even grown-ups stared in disbelief. She said she fully trusted Ash would rise even higher, and she was sure time was all it would take before he finally left the village and carved out his own legend. Finally, Ukiah leaned in and warned Micah. Once you've got real talent, crowds of people start closing in, some will cheer you on. But not everyone's coming with good intention. She warned that once Ash started racking up wins, people would turn green with jealousy, stealing his credit, or crawling out to sabotage and even hurt him. Micah knew everyone should treasure Ash, but she also couldn't ignore how hopelessly unlikely that dream was. Being the village chief's only daughter, she felt every pair of eyes on her, like people were constantly judging her because of the power she was born into. Knowledge, she looked Ukiah in the eye and said she finally got what she was trying to say. Ukiah, playing Micah's mother, felt a sharp sting of shame because her daughter had been forced to speak up and bring those concerns to the table. Still, she realized Micah could put his thoughts into words. That kind of maturity hit like strength. and it proved he had what it took to back up Ash. Yukiya urged Mika to rally loyal allies for Ash and shove away anyone who came to hurt him. She pushed her to guard Ash with everything she had and back him every step as he chased what he loved. Mika couldn't shake the thought of what it even meant to carry that kind of responsibility, guarding someone as sharp and reliable as Ash. Always buried in studies, glowing from afar like a distant star, she couldn't shake the thought. Could she really be the one who would stand in front of him and keep him safe? Yukiya reassured her that even if this mission feels terrifying right now, Mika is exactly the kind of person Ash will need. She's saying that with time, Mika will step up, back Ash's dreams with everything he's got, and finally stand right beside him firm and unshakable. Mika admitted she didn't know if she could meet those expectations, but she'd go for it because her mum believed in her. Yukiya softly patted her head, full of faith in her daughter's skills, and promised, "I'll teach you everything I've got so you can succeed." Mika bit back his doubts and chose to blaze down Ash's exact trail, swearing she'd give it everything, even with the hard road ahead, and promising she'd protect him no matter what came for them. They dove into the basics of beekeeping, then mapped out every tool they'd need and prepped it all for the harvest season that was coming. As they kept up their routine, Ash, Mika, and Tanya mapped out what to do next. And Ash argued that hive boxes should go where flowers bloom thickest so the honeybees can grab pollen fast. Yet, when he scanned the village, there just weren't many spots that truly fit the bill. He first decided to set the hives right by the village's farmland, thinking the bees would do more than make honey. They'd boost pollination, and could mean a bigger harvest of vegetables and native wild strawberries. Ash also eyed the forest as another smart option, and Tanya nodded hard. Her dad used to drag hive boxes into the woods every single season. She told me her mother never rode with him because the deeper parts of that forest were way too deadly even for seasoned men, and that's exactly why her father stayed so cautious about pushing his beekeeping further in there. Ash nodded at Tanya, admitting the forest could turn savage even for seasoned experts, and he feared that if they picked it, tracking down a safe spot for the hives would be a nightmare. Ever since Ash started apprenticing under Bon, he'd been slipping deeper into the forest, but Tanya didn't have to go far before she hit stretches where the path vanished into nothing, and Ash still remembered the time he'd once nearly bolted off a trail, his heart hammering the whole way. Because Ban knew the forest like the back of his hand, Ash figured he might spot some safer spots for beekeeping and decided to corner him the next time they ran into each other. Tanya leaned in and asked if Ash was close to Ban, and Ash nodded, saying Ban had been a huge help to him. Then he turned the tables and demanded why Tanya called Ban Barney. Tanya's cheeks flared red, and she hurriedly snapped, "No, Ash, that's not what you're thinking." Then she confessed that Bon used to come by her house when they were kids. Ash and Mika locked eyes, and Ash said, "This feels way too convenient." Mika nodded right along, and Tanya snapped back, "There's nothing else to it. No secret meaning behind that nickname." Meme Ash jumped in to calm her down, saying there was nothing to fret and that he knew Tanya and Bon were just old acquaintances. Then Tanya nodded and admitted that back when they were younger, Ban didn't really hang out with her much at all, because he mostly talked with her parents. She told me her dad kept slipping into the forest, and since Ban came from a whole bloodline of hunters, their missions kept colliding out there. Ash saw a chance and pounced on it. Maybe Ban knew if Tanya's father had built his own hive boxes, but Tanya just admitted she wasn't sure. Ash was convinced that banding together with help would boost their beekeeping and even Tanya's life. So he pushed Mika to call everyone in for a meeting with Bon. Mika nodded and promised she'd tell her mother they needed to set it up. But Yukiya wasn't ready to dive into that meeting yet. Next, everything slammed into the first time Tanya and Ban met at the chief's house, and Yukiya pushed for a dinner talk because that was the perfect moment to hash everything out. During dinner, Ash caught it. Tanya started the meeting trembling with nerves, but as the minutes dragged on, her fear burned away and resolve finally set in. Eventually, Tanya shot up from her seat, slipped out of the ban, and poured out her heartfelt thanks for everything he'd done for her, saying she hated leaning on his kindness, but still wanted to become a beekeeper like her parents, and begged him to help. Ban agreed on the spot, said he still remembered where Tanya's father used to build his hive boxes, and added that he'd spotted a bunch more great spots deep in the forest. Ban promised he'd step in any time when he wasn't busy hunting, or whenever he found a spare moment during the hunt. If Tanya didn't mind, he was ready to jump in and help her without a second thought. Tanya kept thanking him over and over, and Ban waved it off, grinning like, "Don't worry, I'm just happy to help." After that, Yuki slipped Ash and Micah aside and whispered that she'd head to the kitchen to cook dinner. She let out a breath of pure relief, grinning like it finally all clicked. And Ash nodded along, agreeing, and said it looked like Ban had been caring for Tanya for ages, and it felt damn good to see everything finally turning the right way. With help from the band, they finally nailed down where to set the hive boxes, and their whole beekeeping future suddenly looked bright and unstoppable. After dinner, Tanya headed home with a huge grin, still buzzing over how thrilled she was to finally dive into beekeeping with Ban. She just prayed Jekyll would get how excited she was. Then she finally got home and rushed to apologize for coming back so late. And Jekyll, already sitting at the dining table, stood up and waved it off like it was nothing, saying he'd already eaten leftover wheat porridge for dinner. He then asked how the meeting went, and Tanya lit it all out so much got discussed, and Ban even agreed to help with their beekeeping. Jekyll's eyes widened at that. Tanya added that Jekyll already knew Ban slipped into the forest all the time, which is exactly why Ban knew where her father once placed the hive boxes. Jekyll nodded, taking it all in, but acted like it didn't bother him at all. He told everyone he was going to sleep, and once he finally lay down, he caught himself replaying the past and realizing he might still be able to step in and help the same way. Micah replayed the words in her head. If she could become strong enough to protect Ash, it wouldn't just be good news, it would be fate, and she'd stand right by him, backing every move he made. She felt like her mother's words were ringing in her head for real. Then Micah made sense to her. Ash was wickedly smart, always testing new ideas like beekeeping and whipping up aloe salve, and he'd even been brave enough to step in and protect her from the Jiggle and his friends. Micah leaned in and told his mother, "If I'm supposed to protect someone as incredible as Ash, I can't stay like this. I've got to level up, and I mean work my butt off." Then she tugged out a tiny wooden sword and told her mum she was going to beg her father to teach her real fencing, because she wanted to get strong, fast. Yuki felt Micah totally missed what her advice was really meant to do, and she just hoped Micah would step in to help Ash handle his relationships with everyone. Micah snapped back that she'd tackle that later, because right now she had to focus on learning how to protect him with her sword. Then it hit her. She'd promised herself she'd visit the church earlier, and she blurted, "I'm leaving now." Just as Micah was about to head out, Yuki said she'd start fencing lessons the next day, then pressed him hard. Was she really going to focus on nothing but fencing? And hadn't Micah even been listening? Yuki fired back that learning real social manners for life in the capital would help her more than anything. Yet Micah still glowed with excitement over the chance to protect. Meanwhile, Ash sat there flipping through a book with Folka, and she suddenly spotted the same character popping up over and over again. Then told Ash that if they could crack what it meant, they'd finally start making real progress decoding the language. He said you can't just shove an interpretation in there. What sounds right in one line can turn totally wrong in the next. And that's how you end up getting lost on what the character is really trying to say. Ash got what Folka was trying to say, sure. It was just a hunch, but he believed that one symbol could swing the whole meaning, especially when you pair it with the right characters. Folka nodded, and suddenly it clicked. Maybe that's why those sentences looked like total gibberish. Ash grinned and said, "Yeah, that explanation checks out." And if that was true, decoding that language would get even more brutal. Everyone nodded along, saying, "Yeah, we've made progress, but it's like we've only scratched the top layer." He even admitted he'd flipped through a beekeeping book the other day, yet couldn't find a single section that would help him decode the language. Ash leaned in and asked if it was okay to borrow the beekeeping book. Foki nodded and watched as Ash went all in on the idea of starting beekeeping. And then Ash said he'd already talked it over with Yuki and couldn't wait to dive in right now. Especially with spring creeping closer, so Folk leaned in and asked what Ash was focused on, calling out that sudden change, because Ash had been saying just the other day that he was working with aloe. Ash made it crystal clear if Foko meant the aloe salve, then Yuki and the other women were already running the sales. He fired off that he had to learn beekeeping ASAP and swore he'd carry that book with him the same day right then. Tanya and Micah showed up, knocked hard, and Ash couldn't believe they'd arrived at the perfect moment. Tanya and Micah met them and welcomed them in. Then Tanya made it clear she wanted to start her studies there too, swearing a respectful vow to Father Folka. Folka immediately confirmed that Tanya was in, and they all fired up their study session, learning beekeeping together like it was the coolest mission ever. Micah and Tanya rolled into the study area, and he cracked open the book and started reading right away. Ash dived into the info that honeybees forage for flowers within a 2 to 3 mile radius, guessed the symbol next to the numbers was a distance unit, and Micah and Tanya couldn't believe how fast he caught on. Micah shot an apology and admitted the material was way over their heads, then begged Ash to explain it, so Ash nodded, apologized too for pushing ahead, and said he'd first read it through, then break everything down piece by piece. Micah went along with the plan, and Tanya rushed to Ash with a real apology for forcing him to teach them everything, only for Ash to wave it off and say it's totally fine, because the moment he could start learning beekeeping, he'd be thrilled to help. He said the book was packed with knowledge, but some things you just couldn't learn by reading. You had to get your hands dirty and experience them for yourself. He told them that if they ran into anything tied to real tools or practical processes, he'd put Tanya's expertise front and center, and Tanya immediately nodded, ready to jump in and help. Then the three of them huddled up and read together, soaking up the secrets of beekeeping until it finally clicked. After Tanya spotted her parents working with bees back then, she caught on fast every time she finally understood what a new thing was for. Her face lit up with pure excitement and delight. Ash was convinced that with Ban backing them, their beekeeping dream was about to take off, and those church study sessions suddenly felt way more alive. Plus, as they read, Ash couldn't stop talking about using beehives to make candles because it could hand people cheap, everyday light without breaking the bank. Mika couldn't stop smiling as she praised the honey Tanya had collected the other day as absolutely delicious, and Tanya shot back, asking if she meant the honey from the wolf beehive. Then she broke it all down. He said if beekeeping actually worked and they could pull in a huge honey haul, that sweet gold wouldn't just sit there. It would fuel cooking, power sweets, and a ton of other tasty uses. Micah lit up at the idea and said she really hoped it would work out. Ash pushed that if they could make sellable goods in town, their earnings would jump fast, and Tanya nodded hard, saying she had to learn beekeeping the right way and grind for everyone in the village. Then she jabbed at a specific part of the book and told Ash to break it down for her. Ash scanned the passage and told everyone to watch when the plants that fed the bees with nectar and pollen were blooming, even as temperatures shifted. Then, using that info, he demanded the hive boxes be moved to match the new conditions. He figured this was the cue to shuffle the hive boxes with every new season. And Tanya nodded along because her father used to do the exact same thing back when she was little. Ash told them to quiz Ban about it the next time they saw him, and Tanya nodded along. Micah then leaned in and grilled Tanya about her latest trips into the forest. Was it really as brutal as it looked? Tanya admitted it was brutal, then said she had to get used to moving through the forest so she could do her job as a beekeeper. So she'd been training with Ban, while Ash stayed close to back them up. Even though Ash didn't mind it much, he couldn't deny the whole experience still felt a little terrifying. Tanya told Ash and Micah she'd only stepped into the forest's safer outer edge, but when they finally turned back, she was utterly drained. Ash admitted that trekking through the forest was brutal, then told Tanya to fire off any questions, ask him or Ban any time. Tanya then snapped that her worries weren't about the forest at all. They were about something she couldn't stand to bring up with Ash. She told Tanya this whole mess traces back to Jekyll. She admitted Ash might not want to hear a word about him. But the truth hit hard. She had no one else to trust, so she just had to say it. Ash told her it was okay and urged her to talk, straight from the heart, about everything that was eating her up inside. Tanya thanked Ash and spilled the truth lately. Jekyll had stopped listening to her, acting distant and lost in his own head, and every time she tried to bring it up, his rage flared, then he snapped away and ran off. Tanya also admitted she was basically stepping into Jekyll's life as a stand-in for her parents. She could maybe cover for her mum, but trying to take over her father's role felt brutally harder. Ash realized Tanya was drowning under responsibilities and emotional weight she couldn't possibly carry by herself. Tanya noticed Jekyll didn't hang with his friends anymore, and that scared her like he was shutting everyone out to bury whatever was tearing him up inside. Ash admitted that dealing with messy emotions just like Jekyll's was something he struggled with too, but he still pushed forward to help Tanya, because with her parents gone, she had barely anyone she could lean on without fear. Ash jumped in and promised he'd nudge Jekyll to finally open up about what was haunting him. Tanya immediately apologized and begged Ash not to shoulder all of this for her. Micah pressed Ash, asking if he was really sure about jumping into this, and Ash shot back that he planned to talk to Jekyll about it. Even so, he admitted Jekyll might hate him, so he decided to slow down, think hard, and plan exactly how to kick off that conversation. At that exact moment, Jekyll sat alone out in the grassland, drowning in his own thoughts. Ash slid up to him, pointed out that dusk had already fallen, and asked if Jekyll wasn't going home. Then the second Jekyll heard Ash's voice, he snapped to his feet, face blazing with anger, and demanded if Ash had come to get revenge from their last run-in. Ash cut him off fast, insisting he had no intention of fighting, and said he just wanted to talk for a while. Jekyll snapped his head away and told Ash he had nothing to say to him, but Ash shot back that he needed a moment because this was about Tanya. And it was important. Jekyll hesitated, so Ash kept going, saying Tanya had been acting all kinds of troubled lately, whether she was trying beekeeping with them or slipping off into the forest side by side with Ban. Ash pressed Jekyll on why he really didn't want his sister to get better, then insisted he'd step in because her safety mattered and her mind deserved peace. Too, he finished by saying he only hoped Jekyll might know something that could finally explain what the heck was going on. Jekyll's rage exploded as he barked at Ash to shut up, because Ash was the very last person he wanted to deal with. When Ash snapped that this was Tanya's business, Jekyll exploded, saying it was exactly the issue, claiming Ash always tried to cozy up to everyone, like he couldn't live without their approval, and then he cut in. He said Ash's act made him sick, told him to stop pretending he's being helpful, and shut him down to mind his own business. Then he barreled straight into Ash, spitting accusations that he didn't have a clue what Tanya had gone through and how much it hurt. Offered Jekyll slammed Ash to the ground and snatched him by the collar and seethed with raw resentment at what he believed was Ash's arrogant attitude. Arrogance exploded in him. He swung his words like fists, claiming that because Ash could read and write and even make medicine, that somehow meant, and flipped through the beekeeping book, but it didn't turn him into some chosen prodigy. Jekyll snapped, demanding to know why those tiny wins were suddenly pulling Ash into non-stop praise, and demanded to know why Tanya leaned on him so hard. Overwhelmed by emotion, Jekyll blurted out why Ash could nail everything, while he barely scraped by, trying to take care of his own sister. And he confessed he'd been stuck in his head non-stop about how to help Tanya, because deep down he'd always been the one closest to her. Tears spilled down his face as Jekyll grappled with one brutal question: why couldn't he save her, while Ash seemed to nail every single thing he attempted? Ash shot back that he couldn't win at everything, and he admitted that whenever he couldn't handle something by himself, he'd always leaned on other people to get it done. He confessed he'd been stuck wondering if he'd ever be able to calm Tanya's fears on his own, so he came straight to Jekyll for help. Ash said he didn't care if people hated him, but he begged Jekyll to back Tanya just this once. Jekyll slowly blinked through the blur, rubbing his eyes as the two of them sat shoulder to shoulder. Then, after a beat, he finally started talking and told Tanya how, back when their parents were still alive, he and her had been out in the fields together, sweating their guts out just to keep food on the table. They could never scrape together more than the bare minimum, yet somehow they kept standing, always surviving. And when life got cruel, they clung to each other and didn't break. Jekyll realized it hit him only when he saw Tanya clutch a book tight and break down in tears, saying that he finally clocked just how badly she wanted to chase beekeeping. At that moment, it hit him. Tanya had silently buried her own wants just to keep him from worrying. Even as she kept pushing him forward every single day through the brutal hardships, he finally admitted it. Somewhere along the way, he started feeling like he was nothing but a weight on his sister's back. He'd been telling himself they were helping each other, but now he could see how wrong and foolish he'd been. He was totally clueless about beekeeping, and even worse, he couldn't make heads or tails of the book in front of him. All he knew was to toil in the fields, and it made him feel totally helpless, watching her dreams slip out of reach. Jekyll then spilled the truth. He'd just realized Tanya was getting closer to Ban, and it terrified him that she might end up marrying him, a thought that's been crushing his heart and leaving him feeling deeply. Ash looked worried and asked if that was really why Jekyll was hurting, but Jekyll shook his head and admitted it wasn't just Tanya getting closer to Ban. What crushed him most was guilt. Tanya had never cared about romance before, and Jekyll was certain it was his own fault. He said Tanya always put him ahead of herself, and he was sure people must have come for her before, until she shut them down. All for his sake, while Jekyll admitted the truth he actually liked Ban, even though Ban could be a pain to talk to sometimes. Ash snorted that Ban wasn't exactly the best conversationalist, and Jekyll nodded, saying Ban kept to himself way too much still. If he ever had to hand his sister to someone, it would only be to someone he could trust with his life. Jekyll told me he felt it was his duty to push Tanya toward a relationship with Ban, because he honestly swore Ban was a genuinely good guy. He even confessed that it felt like he was constantly in Tanya's way whenever she tried to chase her own happiness, and that crushed him, because he hated himself for it. He told her to forget about him, marry Ban, and live the life she'd always wanted, even if that meant becoming a beekeeper. At the same time, Jekyll admitted that if Tanya ever walked out the door, he'd be completely lost, no idea what to do or where to go, because he felt cornered, stuck, and powerless to move ahead, and he admitted he couldn't even put those feelings into words to Tanya, knowing his silence only piled on her worries. Ash finally caught the full weight of how broken Jekyll was inside, and how that same fight was ripping through Tanya too. Then, as Ash stared at the problem, he knew what would truly matter. Jekyll needed a clear path, a real purpose, something that could light his way and help him carve out his own future. After making up his mind, Ash grabbed Jekyll's attention and told him he had a real plan. He could land him a proper job, one that would also calm Tanya's fears for good. Jekyll leaned in, hungry for answers about the job, and Ash told him the real kicker: Jekyll was lucky, because a tradesman right in the neighborhood was actively hunting for an apprentice. Jekyll nearly choked on the news and demanded if it could really be true, and Ash shot back that he'd heard it straight from the man's own mouth, so strapped for help that he agreed to teach his craft right in the open, passing his skills to a brand new apprentice, flooded with pure, trembling relief. Chief Jekyll snapped his hands together, then begged Ash to introduce him to the tradesman, swearing he'd do anything they needed. No matter how tiny or brutal the task looked, Ash didn't flinch. He agreed, promised he'd ask the man to come to Jekyll on a day he was free, and Jekyll practically breathed a sigh of relief. Then Jekyll admitted he'd never stood a chance against Ash, apologized for how badly he'd acted, and Ash cut in fast, saying the request would be easy and that he didn't hold it against him. Jekyll made it crystal clear that his apology didn't stop. At that moment, it covered what he did in the woods too, admitting his frustration was fueled by one thing: he couldn't pull off anything that mattered, while Ash breezed through everything and got praised for it. Crushed and hopeless, Jekyll started viewing Ash as a real threat, and when the pressure hit, he lashed out hard in self-defense. Still, deep down, he knew Ash had never exposed him or humiliated him. Then Jekyll dropped to his knees in front of Ash and poured out a heartfelt, soul-bearing apology. Ash snatched it from his hands, waved him off, and told him he shouldn't worry because he'd never once taken Jekyll's actions personally. He shot his hand out, and they clapped fists together right then. Their reconciliation was sealed. When Jekyll realized the tradesman was banned, his jaw dropped in pure shock. Then he immediately bolted after Ash, yelling that Ash should have brought up that huge detail from the very start. Jekyll went on, stunned as Van abruptly demanded he work under him, and Ash snapped back that Jekyll had already agreed to the apprenticeship before he ever learned who the tradesman was. Then he pitched the idea that Jekyll should tag along for their church study sessions, because if he learned beekeeping the right way, he could end up helping Tanya even more. Still rattled, Jekyll blurted that he didn't know how he was meant to memorize all of it, then admitted that frustration had nearly pushed him to swing at Ash, but Ash just stayed cool and told him to relax, saying that with real study and effort, nobody would ever have to turn to violence. Jekyll soon jumped into his apprenticeship with Ban, drilling the basics of hunting wild game while also helping out with the beekeeping. As the moments piled up, relief finally hit him hard, because Tanya's worries were getting dealt with at last. One day, while Ban, Ash, Tanya, and Jekyll pushed into the forest together, Jekyll leaned in and warned Tanya to keep her footing. One wrong step could spell disaster. Tanya thanked him for worrying about her, and Ash couldn't help but praise how solid and dependable Jekyll had turned into. Jekyll flashed a confident grin and promised he'd handle everything himself. Ever since Jekyll became Ban's apprentice, Ash noticed one thing: he threw himself into hunting with real seriousness. While Jekyll trained, he also learned to read and write at the church and then dug into the basics of beekeeping too. He swallowed the blame for the rock-throwing incident, then went and formally apologized to Ash and Tanya, face to face, showing up at Ash's place in person to set things right, all at once. By then, Tanya had been pushing her beekeeping prep forward step by step, while Yukiya kept the aloe salve business booming. Ash raked in steady cash from his salve sales, and that money kept his experiments alive. Pens, paper, firewood, everything, so his research finally hit full speed. Search, his latest win, was cooking up test samples of salves and candles made from materials he pulled straight from beehives too. With winter creeping closer, he'd already kicked off yet another crucial research project. That season always meant death for the villagers, and Ash couldn't stop his mind from snapping back to his past growing up in Noskula, where food and medicine were nowhere to be found, and people kept dropping from sickness until even a harmless cold became fatal just because there was no real treatment. And because of it, some villagers would suddenly spike with deadly fevers, lose their appetite, and wither away in brutal pain. Until death, winter after winter, it happened again and again, and every time the season crept closer, Ash couldn't stop the memories from his past crashing into him, especially the days he'd spent at home with his mother. He still remembered the day TL showed up just to pick him up, and just like that, his mother greeted him with open arms and a warm smile after a few quick pleasantries. Ash leaned in and told her he'd be out playing with Tyler, then be back later. She grinned and wished them both a great time, and Ash still remembered how he and Tila had jumped in with their friends, laughing and having an absolute blast. After a while, Tila got worn out, flopped down, and snapped that he felt unusually hot. But Ash figured it was probably because Tila had been sprinting around non-stop. Then right after, their stomachs started roaring, and Tila blurted that he was starving and desperately needed food. Ash sat there, quiet as a grave, sadness crushing his chest until Tyel leaned in and told him, "Don't worry." Then Tyel urged them to pray to the monkey god for a bountiful harvest, adding that Ash's father was already grinding in the forest, so food had to be coming. Ash warned them that winter was creeping in fast and told everyone to head home early. Dla told Ash he was hoping things wouldn't get too cold, said he'd head home for now, but would return later to keep playing. And Ash shot back that he'd be right there waiting. Then, Tyler warned he'd be gone for a while and begged him not to cry, and Ash promised, "Don't worry, I won't." After Tila finally took off, Ash was chilling at home when his mother came in and demanded to talk straight about Tila. Ash asked if Thyle was finally getting better, remembering how totally fine he looked just the other day. After that day ended, and after they promised they'd play again, once he was back on his feet, he leaned in and asked if he could swing by Tila the very next day. Ash clocked it instantly. His mother looked sick, pale and worn out, and he demanded to know what was wrong. She leaned in and told him softly but clearly that Tila couldn't play with him anymore because he was gone. Ash went completely numb with shock and blurted, "How could this even happen?" Sheila yanked him into a tight embrace and reminded him Thiel caught that cold and it never got better. Ash just couldn't accept it, shaking his head like he was trying to fight the truth. Sheila told everyone the truth. Tila's condition kept spiraling, starting with that brutal cold, then turning into a relentless fever that simply wouldn't break until it finally stole his life. She had no idea how to comfort Ash, but she still grabbed his heart with one truth: he had to stay brave because losses like this could hit again someday. Ash demanded to know why it had to repeat in the future, and he pushed the question hard. Could a cold really never be cured? Sheila shot back that it wasn't something you could just cure, at least not in their village. Later, Ash stood in front of Thalei's grave, stunned to the bone, while rain hammered down all around him. He couldn't stop thinking about all the people he'd known who had walked straight into the same brutal fate, and couldn't stop wondering why life kept turning so cruel and dangerous. He couldn't stop asking himself why he'd failed to save a single soul. Right then, Sheila burst in and shouted at Ash, asking why he was still standing outside in the freezing cold. World's worry hit her hard. She demanded to know if he was okay, and Ash shot back an apology for not making it home on time. Sheila was already crying, clutched him in a tight hug, and whispered that everything was okay, that he was a good boy, and stuff like this happens in life, so he didn't have to hate himself for it. Ash shoved those brutal memories to the side and threw himself into his writing instead. He prayed everything could finally change, because if his research paid off, they'd stand a real chance of surviving winter way safer than ever. Right then, Ash was busy cooking up an antipyretic fever soother brewed from a willow-like tree bark, something old-timers swore could crush fevers, calm pain, and calm inflammation. But with winter creeping closer, he barely had time to double-check everything, and that urgency hit hard. He had to push it into real use, fast. Even if it only shaved off a tiny slice of cold-related deaths, he swore it would all be worth it. One day, Ash finally started making real progress, and finishing his fever reducer felt right around the corner until he remembered this broth brewed from willow bark could trigger a rare, brutal reaction if the conditions were just right. Even though the botany guide never warned about these symptoms, and every experiment he'd run so far had stayed perfectly safe, no red flags, no dangerous side. He finally clocked it. His sloppy lack of deep research had left him careless. Ash already tested the medicine on marmots and even on himself without a single thing going wrong. But that didn't calm him down. He slammed the brakes on distributing it until he figured out what was really setting off those terrifying reactions, and he vowed to hunt for safer ingredients instead. Suddenly, Ash's mother burst in, breathless, then dropped the worst news of all. Micah had collapsed from a brutal high fever. She said Micah was barely awake, wouldn't answer when they called her name, and her temperature was still climbing fast, like it was out of control, and if nobody acted fast, she was terrified Micah wouldn't make it out alive. Ash's eyes snapped straight to the medicine he'd already brewed. He knew it could knock fever down, but he also realized he didn't have time to figure out what could set off those rare, deadly symptoms. They didn't have time to plan any other treatment, and there was zero room for hesitation. He snapped to the truth and knew he had to move right now. He couldn't shake the memories of Micah, and the second he pictured her suffering the same fate as Tiela, his heart just refused to accept it. Ash clutched the medicine like it could save a life, panic roaring in his chest, and he burst out of the house to tell his mother he was heading straight to Micah's home. As he tore through the village, Ash refused to let her slip away. He was clinging to one desperate hope that the medicine would finally work this time, and that he'd actually managed to save someone when it mattered. The story cut to Micah, gasping for air, as scorching heat and icy cold slammed through her body one after the other, feelings she hated with every fiber of her being. Her body felt like it was made of stone, and fear crushed her thoughts as she prayed anyone would come rescue her. And then Ash's voice cut through the panic, asking if she was okay. Lying half dead in bed, Micah listened as he talked to her parents, and her stomach dropped. Why did he come at all? In the blur of her fever, she caught Ash whispering about whether he should give her that medicine, and then she heard him tell the village chief that it could smash even the wildest fever. He even admitted there was a rare chance the treatment could backfire with nasty adverse reactions. Micah got it right away. Sure, the medicine could beat down her fever, but it might also tip her condition the wrong way, and that's why they couldn't bring themselves to move. Even though the medicine terrified her, Micah knew her situation was worse. Refusing it could make everything spiral faster, and the thought of suffering more, missing out on Ash, or losing the rest of her days altogether, crushed her with dread. Micah then heard Ash say that the instant he learned she'd collapsed, he knew there was no way he could hesitate. He apologized for the confusion about the medicine, but then swore with his whole heart that all he wanted was for her to live. Determined as steel, Micah stormed out of her room and announced she was taking that medicine. Yukiya lunged in front of her and demanded she stop, warning that pacing would only make things worse and that she needed rest. Then Micah stepped in, telling Yukiya she'd overheard everything and was sure that if Ash made the medicine, it would absolutely work. She snapped everyone to hurry, insisting she wasn't done. She wanted to keep studying and work shoulder to shoulder with Ash. Even though Yukiya hesitated, Micah wouldn't back down. She swore she'd taken her decision and would swallow the medicine no matter what happened next. Yukiya spun toward Klein, begging for his call, and when he spotted the fire in Micah's eyes, Klein nodded. He'd respect her choice, no questions asked. He gently laid his hand on her head, urged her to take the medicine, and promised she'd bounce back fast. Klein leaned in and asked Ash if everything was ready to go. Ash nodded and said that's exactly what he'd do. He planned to watch Micah's condition like a hawk and give the medicine in tiny, careful doses to keep her safe. Micah called out to Ash and told him not to worry, she'd bounce back soon. Ash could only hold her breath, praying the medicine hit its mark, begging that Micah would pull through. A few days later, Ash marched up to the chief's house and apologized for showing up without warning, and Micah swept him inside. She was up in bed, resting. Ash leaned in and asked if she could sit up, and Micah nodded that she felt steady, then told him her fever had been brutal before, but thanks to Ash's medicine, she was finally starting to feeling fine again. Ash let out a breath of relief, and handed her a glass of water freshly prepared by Yukiya. Micah thanked him, took a sip, and said she actually loved the taste. Then Ash lit up and told her the truth. The water was stirred with salt and honey, both packed with benefits for her body. Micah thanked him again, and Ash waved it off with a grin, telling her it was no trouble at all. He just loved seeing her enjoy it. Micah gently urged her to rest, and when she finally laid back down, she asked if Ash was thinking of leaving. Ash paused for a beat, then jumped in and offered to stay, chatting with her a while longer, and told her if she didn't mind that his beehive experiments had just started paying off in a big way. The second Micah heard that, she practically buzzed with excitement and fired off, "So what kind of progress did you make?" Ash admitted he'd already managed to whip up working candles and salves, but he also warned that the real work wasn't done yet. He still had to dig deeper to figure out what happened when he mixed aloe salve with the other stuff he was testing. Micah couldn't believe how impressive Ash was, and Ash just shrugged. Most of his progress came straight from his beekeeping book, a goldmine of step-by-step guidance on how the whole manufacturing process works. He also told her that his fever medicine was getting better, and he even found a new herb that seemed safer than the willow bark he'd given her before. Now he was testing it, and Micah just stared, shocked. She'd never even heard of a thing like that. Then he pressed, "So what's your next move?" Ash shot back an apology for everything that went down earlier. He admitted that because he hadn't researched enough, he'd let her swallow a medicine packed with needless danger, and he swore that if he'd clocked the risk factors sooner, he would have pushed a far safer treatment from the start. Micah leaned in and told Ash he didn't have to apologize, because if he hadn't sprinted to bring her the medicine, she'd still be feeling miserable right now. She told him how much she truly appreciated all of it, then leaned in and asked how his new fever reducer trials were going. Ash said everything was running smooth as silk, and that he was determined to have the medicine fully ready before winter rolled in. He told me he'd already talked it through with Yukiya. She was gearing up her home to hoard fever reducers and food, so she could hand it out the moment anyone started getting sick. Micah shot a question at Ash about how the setup would work, and Ash explained it was built to spare the village because feeding and medicating every household was brutal and insanely expensive. So Yukiya would keep the supplies. The villagers could finally grab what they needed without playing the waiting game with that occasional traveling peddler. Miller Micah snapped that if folks could snag medicine and essentials straight from Yukiya, people wouldn't have to panic so much when colds hit. And Ash fired back that this was the whole point of the plan. He told them straight up that his priority had to be cranking out enough fever medicine so every villager could get an equal fair dose. Finally, Ash snapped that he couldn't stay a second longer. Micah was told to slow down, stop burning herself out, and finally get some real rest, and Micah nodded along, thanking Ash for worrying about her. Then Ash brought up the beehive salve and asked her if she'd be down to help him test it sometime down the road. Micah didn't hesitate, and Ash shot her a grateful nod, urging her to put her full recovery first before anything else. Micah vowed she'd push through her cold as fast as humanly possible. Ash finally stepped out with Yukiya, throwing out a quick apology for disappearing for so long. But Yukiya shut him down with a smile. She waved off the sorry and instead thanked him from the bottom of her heart for helping Micah. Ash leaned in and told her he'd run serious tests on the fever reducer, then swore he'd bring it to her the moment it was finally ready. Yukiya lit up with gratitude because thanks to Ban and Jekyll's hard work and the cash they pulled in from the aloe salve, the village was stacked with food with money to spare too. She bowed and thanked Ash for the village chief's household, praising how his efforts left them ready for winter. But Ash pushed it back, saying the real thanks belonged to Yukiya and every villager who stood with him while he worked. Yukiya said they had always braced for winter losses, but she couldn't shake the gut feeling that this year would hit different. Ash nodded at her words, then dug in harder than ever, determined to keep everyone safe through the brutal winter. He just prayed that when spring finally came, they'd stand together, every last villager alive, safe and breathing. As Ash walked away, he couldn't stop thinking about Yukiya's unshakable optimism. Even with that confidence on her face, he couldn't shake the truth he'd dosed Micah with medicine that might have been dangerous, and he still couldn't find a single reference to the severe symptoms he'd been terrified of. He finally understood that the village had hard limits on what he could do, medicine included, and that his quest for knowledge couldn't stay trapped here. That comfy, safe life he craved still felt light years away. But Ash knew the truth. One day he'd have to bolt from the village, push toward the capital and get his hands on more books, deeper answers, and the kind of resources that could change everything. Right now, he decided to keep grinding with what he had and prep like crazy for the day he finally got home, where Ash ran up to greet his mother, and then David, drunk and yelling, burst into their moment, and he tore into Ash with harsh scolding, accusing him of spending way too much time buried in books, and snapping that he should have been out in the fields doing real work instead. David always said that if you were born into a farming family, your value came down to one thing: how fiercely you worked the fields. He was convinced that if you poured your heart into your work, kept a warm smile on your face, and showed real grit, people would respect you and you'd be able to provide for your family. But Ash was different. While everyone else threw themselves into farm work, he zipped through his chores and dove into his books like they were his whole world. Even after David warned over and over that skipping the fields would ruin their harvest, Ash just doubled down on his studies, totally ignoring the danger. Before David could even catch his breath, Ash had already swept into the village chief's family plans, pushing his own ideas like a storm, and started brewing beer and mixing medicine just to keep himself far from farm work. Even though David respected Ash's insane accomplishments and knew how brutal studying could be, doubt still gnawed at him. Sheila always beamed and bragged that Ash was the pride and joy of their family. David agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Ash needed to spend more time out in the fields. Later, as David clinked beers with his friends, he fired off the claim that farm work mattered way more than studying, especially for the son of a farmer. One friend stepped in, saying Ash may have helped in the fields, but his real obsession was academics, while another friend shot back that Ash wasn't dodging work at all and that David was just panicking too hard. Then the first friend shrugged and said, maybe David's worry was just because Ash is ridiculously smart and can't be boxed into the usual role people expect. The third guy couldn't help but smirk and go, come on, it's hard to believe Ash is actually David's son. Fuming over that comment, David snapped and launched an angry attack at him. The man shot back with an instant apology, blurting that he was only messing around, and Sheila even backed David when everyone else doubted him. And one friend tried to cool the tension by pushing David to take another drink. David slammed his cup empty in one gulp and barked for everyone to shut up loudly. When he finally stumbled back home, David crumpled where he stood, head drooping so low, it looked like he might not get up again. Sheila demanded to know how much he'd had to drink, but his words came out mashed and messy, too drunk to even form a real answer. Sheila shoved him to move faster, barking that he needed to get ready because she still had a stack of tasks left to finish. David nodded in agreement, then lifted his head and realized Ash still hadn't come home. Right then and there, David made up his mind. When Ash finally showed up, he'd lay down the law as the father he is and hit him with a brutal reprimand. Ash wouldn't be able to shake. When Ash finally showed up, David snapped at him to throw himself into the fields and quit wasting time with books. Ash's gloomy look only made David snap harder, so he barked at Ash to sit down. As Ash followed the order, David roared that boys were built to work the fields, and Ash didn't argue. He nodded hard, admitting that farming truly was a man's duty. But he told me that the stuff he learned from books, especially how to manage work and how to handle growing conditions, made his fieldwork so much easier. David barked that Ash was being foolish, yelling that the more time and effort you pour into the fields, the better the harvest gets. Then Ash stayed cool and said he'd already been recording the field's output, and that to grow a better crop, you've got to watch the farmland closely with your own eyes. David dropped his head again, staring at Ash like, why do you have to be this smart? In that moment, he finally faced the truth. He'd been a lousy husband, a worse father, and he'd dropped the ball on his duty to his child. Even with everything that came with it, he couldn't deny it. Ash had grown into a real fine young man. He was even wiser than David, and you could feel the thoughtfulness and care he always poured into Sheila. David's heart twisted as he tried to lecture Ash, because he knew all too well how badly he was flawed, too. At last, he stood up and pressed Ash. So tell me, am I really your son? Ash didn't even pause. He said yes. No matter how you slice it, he was undeniably David's boy. And if that weren't true, he wouldn't be able to make out David's drunken, slurred words so perfectly. David shot Ash a serious look and asked, you mean it? Ash nodded and admitted he'd been watching David from afar since he was a kid. He admitted that chugging his way to proving his strength was nothing to brag about, but David still showed his grit, his way, loud and clear. David took it all in, stunned that Ash had watched his father's failures up close and still somehow turned them into strength, growing into a truly admirable son. He admitted that Ash's way of moving through life lit a fire in him and made him determined to become a better father, starting now. Right then, Sheila marched up to Ash and thanked him for putting up with his father's rambling, because David, she told him, always showed his love in his own loud way. Every time someone praised Ash, David's pride and joy would hit like a wave, overwhelming him. Sure, Sheila then leaned in and told Ash not to mention that she'd talked to him about all this. And Ash nodded, agreeing on the spot and swearing he'd keep it to himself. As the days dragged on, spring finally burst onto the scene. It rolled in like clockwork, the Spring Tiding Festival, built to light up the whole village's heart before everyone had to march right back to the fields. That year, the festival lit up like crazy because the villagers had survived the harsh winter without losing even one life. Ash couldn't help but beam. He'd really pulled it off. Then David slid up beside him, grinning and saying the whole place felt electric, because half the villagers were already so drunk they could barely stand. Ash leaned in and asked if David had been drinking less this year. David admitted he was trying to say it loud and clear. He had to start acting like a more responsible father. Ash shot back, saying he was proud to be the son of a man so respectable, and as David heard it, he straightened a little, pride swelling in his chest. Ash then said cutting David's alcohol way down would most likely make his health soar. He straight up admitted he wasn't strong yet, so his whole heart surged with gratitude because his father was solid, dependable, and exactly who he could lean on. David cracked up and told Ash he wasn't ready to beat him just yet. But he smirked and promised no matter what David would be there whenever Ash needed backup. Then Ash spilled that he had a favor to ask right as David turned and asked, "What favor?" Ash leaned in and told me Tanya started brewing beer, so her fields were finally left idle. Then he said they'd talked through how to split the work of keeping those fields running and asked if David and I could team up to handle it. Ash even threw in that he had an experiment he wanted to try. David shrugged it off, saying it was no big deal at all and that managing the extra fields wouldn't be a problem. Ash looked relieved and offered to jump in and help with the added tasks. An extra workload would shut him down with a shake of the head and told Ash not to spiral those fields at Tanya's place weren't a problem at all. "I'll handle it myself," he said. Ash practically exhaled from his chest, grateful beyond words, because he knew he could always count on his father. A few days later, once David finally took over the fieldwork, Ash stopped coasting and zeroed in on his brand new experiment right then. Meanwhile, Ash was out in the garden with Micah, and she straight up asked if he thought she was doing okay. Ash nodded, told her she was killing it, and pointed to the next part of the book she needed to tackle. Once she confirmed she got it, he thanked her for backing him up in the experiment. Micah just shrugged and said it was the least she could do, because Ash had stepped in for her when she was sick. Then she pressed, "Is this experiment really that important?" Ash leaned in and said, "If everything goes right, the harvest will spike, and those flowers aren't here just to look pretty. They're meant to strengthen the whole field." He told me he'd ditched the plan at first because their own fields had no room. But then his father threw his weight behind him, and suddenly he had his chance to try again. He pushed the discussion forward and admitted he'd spotted Micah's hands glowing, saying the beehive setup looked like it was actually working. And Micah nodded because that glow was exactly why her skin had turned smooth and healthy. Ash said that since there didn't seem to be any downsides, they should seriously think about selling the product the moment they had a steady supply. Why? Micah still clung to hope that Tanya's beer brewing would pull off, pointing out how hard she'd been working at it, and Ash shot back that Tanya's journey had only just started. He nodded and realized that no matter how much she prepped, her plan kept running into obstacle after obstacle once she tried to make it real. And Micah agreed, swearing that even after all that studying, applying it in the real world was still brutally hard. Ash admitted it wouldn't be easy, then said they all had to live through it to truly get it. Plus, he was already planning to check on Tanya later. Micah asked if she could tag along and help however she possibly could. Ash leaned in and asked if she was really sure, confessing he'd feel crushed with guilt if he kept leaning on her for help. Micah didn't hold back. She said Ash had helped her way more than she'd ever managed to help him. Home, and she added that her mum kept raving about how Ash had powered the whole village with his aloe salve work, his beekeeping, and the fever reducer, saying he'd made a real lasting difference. Ash shot back that she was giving him way too much credit, then told her straight up he couldn't have done any of it solo. He'd needed help from a whole crowd along the way, and he owned that truth. People claimed he knew his actions helped the village, but deep down he chased his own dreams, so yeah, his heart wasn't exactly pure. He made it crystal clear, thank everyone who stood by him, because if he forgets their help, arrogance creeps in, and that's how failure finally gets you. Then he poured out his gratitude to Micah for always being there, but Micah waved it off right away, telling him he didn't owe her a thing. She promised she'd do her best to keep up, and Ash shot back that if she was giving everything, he'd have to grind even harder just to deserve it. Then he added, he couldn't stop himself from pushing for better for everyone. Then the emergency bell suddenly screamed across the village, and Ash spotted villagers bolting past in full panic. One man grabbed the other and demanded if anyone had been attacked. But the second guy just shook his head and admitted they had no way to handle it by themselves. Ash immediately blurted out what was going on, and the man panicked, yelling at them to run because a bear had slipped into the area and the village was suddenly not safe anymore, and Ash and Micah were left utterly stunned. Ash knew bears were omnivores, plants and meat. No problem, but the rumors scared him. If a bear ever got hooked on human flesh, it wouldn't want anything else again. If that monster ever sets its sights on a villager, everything goes up in smoke, total disaster. Bad timing. Those who could handle a threat like this weren't anywhere around village chief Klein. A seasoned swordsman was stuck in the capital, and Ban and Jekyll, fresh off a hunt, had vanished into the forest and wouldn't be back for days. Ash finally realized something terrifying. He was the only hunter in the whole village who actually knew how to deal with a bear. He urged Micah to get everyone to the church and evacuate, then told him he had one thing to handle first. Right after that, he'd come running to join them. Micah was visibly terrified, protested in a shaky voice, and swore it was too dangerous for him to go alone, then pushed to come with him. Ash snapped back, refusing to go, and demanded she rush to the church, tell everyone he'd swing by his place first, because he couldn't stand the idea of people thinking he'd vanished. Micah shouted back, reminding him that the rule was for everyone to race to the church the second that emergency bell rang. Then he insisted he come too, and Ash calmly promised her he'd be fine. He promised he'd reach the church soon, then rested a hand on her shoulder, told her to carry his message to the others, and handed her the responsibility without hesitation. Choked with emotion, Micah begged him to promise he'd come back safe, so Ash swore he would, then bolted back toward his house, and when he finally got there, his parents had already fled to the church. He snapped into action, realizing every second mattered, and grabbed 2 spears, a bow, several arrows, plus a few small hunting tools straight from his quiver. He meant to scare the bear off before it got anywhere near the church. With all his gear packed and ready, Ash bolted back toward the village. Right as he closed in, a thunderous roar ripped through the area. Then he saw it, the bear staring him down. He clocked that hibernation season was over, and he knew the animal had to be out there hunting for food. The moment their eyes locked, Ash instantly got it. The bear wasn't hunting for trouble, it was just scanning for its next meal. He figured letting that bear creep any closer to the church would be suicide. So after a quick burst of thought, he chose the boldest playwalk right up to it and face it head on. With a steady, friendly tone, he made it clear he'd seen the bear in the village, and then he tried to talk it down, and figured if the bear was starving, tossing it food could stop the fight before it even started. Ash watched the bear stay on edge, eyes darting across everything like it was hunting for its next threat. He kept talking, pushing the idea that the bear could fill its belly without hurting a single soul, and then he headed back into the forest, convinced this plan would save both sides. The bear erupted into a terrifying roar, shaking everything around it. Ash's doubts roared louder by the second. Could he really handle what came next? Still, he had no way out. He had to step in and face it, because that bear wasn't about to walk away peacefully. And Ash drew a line in the sand. He wouldn't stand there and let it tear the village apart. He felt the village sink into his bones, like it was the beating heart of his dreams and everything he wanted next. And he swore that if he ever told his story, it would start here, because this place was only the doorway to something way bigger. Ash faced the bear head-on and warned it that if it dared to smash the village, he'd have no choice. He'd stand up and fight back. He didn't just hint it. He boldly proclaimed himself the bear's sworn enemy. When the bear started charging after him, Ash ditched the spears and sprinted away, just to keep the distance. Instead of clinging to his bow and arrows, he decided to protect the village in a whole different way. He loosed an arrow at the bear, but its thick hide swallowed it almost whole. Ash fired back, then he surged at him with brutal force, whipping him into a full retreat. But when the creature lunged again, Ash caught a tiny, eerie glint sparkling on its claws, and he instantly knew it paralytic poison, the same one the hunting band had handed him. Ash was counting on the poison to drag the bear to a crawl, so he moved like lightning, slicked his spear with poison, and braced hard for the next hit. The bear barreled in again, and Ash just barely slipped aside, then drove the spear straight into its side. The moment the contact hit, the bear launched a brutal counterattack. He snapped the spear in half, raked Ash's hand with its claws, then backed off just a few steps. Poisons. Ash grimaced hard as the poison finally kicked in, burning through his body. He knew he had to slam the bleeding to a stop right now. As the bear barreled closer, Ash clocked it. He had only a few minutes before the poison's power burned out. Ash clung to the hope that he could last that long, then yelled at the bear, arguing that with both of them battered and unable to properly use their right arms, it made sense to call the whole fight a draw. The bear screamed and lunged right back in, roaring its defiance like it had zero plans to back down. Ash had no choice. He snatched a nearby stick and slammed it down onto the bear's head. Then he clawed back what was left of his spear and braced for round two, while Ash's hope started to crumble, because he could feel the end coming. Still, he clamped down on his fear, dug his heels in, and braced for the bear's next brutal charge. Fear slammed into him so hard it sent bone-chilling terror roaring through his body, and he knew the odds were stacked against him. Even so, he figured the bear must be terrified too, charging straight at the deadly spear tip like it had no choice. Turning the whole showdown into a life-or-death gamble where anyone could drop, he saw the bear's courage in every beat, because out here in the wild, it had probably battled danger 100 times before, but deep down, he was sure it had never truly met death head-on. His mind got snagged on one brutal thing, dying so vividly it broke through even the fog of his old life, replaying the shaky thump of his heart, his sight dimming inch by inch and the wind roaring loud and alone until consciousness finally slipped away. Ash refused to let that memory crush him. He used it like a brace, turned his fear of death into iron resolve, and forced it to wrestle down the terror that was trying to freeze him in place. Just as the bear charged again, it suddenly froze in its tracks. Ash snapped into action the instant he saw fear finally grip the creature. Then he lunged and drove the spear forward again. Once more, the bear's jaws snapped in inches from its target, but at the last second its strength gave out, and the massive body crashed to the ground and went utterly lifeless, so drained that Ash finally gave in, sank down, and let out a long, heavy breath. He quietly savored his hard-earned win, but the moment he checked how he was holding up, he realized the damage was brutal and the blood was still pouring like it wouldn't stop. Ash knew he had to stop the bleeding right now, and even as pain ripped through his body, he refused to quit. He still had too much left to chase, dreams still waiting to be fulfilled, so he clung to that burning determination and swore to himself he'd survive no matter what. As the villagers scrambled to safety and slammed the church doors shut behind them, Micah's fear for Ash only grew sharper and sharper. David closed in on her and demanded, "Is Ash with you?" Then Micah shot back that Ash said he'd swing by his place first, then come right back to the church. Moments later, a sudden blast of noise ripped through the room and jolted everyone to attention. And the second they realized they couldn't stay there safely, panic started to hit. Alarm bells shot through Micah, and he bolted for the door, demanding it be opened right now. One of the men grabbed her attention and snapped, "Ash still hasn't come back." When Micah tried to slip outside, he blocked the door and warned her it was too dangerous, then told her to stay put while he went out to check. Micah barreled ahead, ignoring her warning, while the others pleaded with her to stop and wait. As she pushed forward, she stumbled on a dead bear's body, and right nearby, Ash lay crumpled on the ground. Seeing him like that snapped terror through her, and the others rushed after her without wasting a second. David grabbed Sheila for a quick check. Then, without even waiting for her answer, he bolted to Ash's side and pleaded, "Hold on." Sheila stood there, frozen in shock, staring at the wreckage like, how in the world could something like this even happen? She snapped her gaze to Yukiya and demanded, "What do we do now?" Yukiya said, "First aid now, before that bleeding gets worse." Ash had jammed on a tourniquet himself, but it was obvious the bleeding hadn't fully quit. As they scrambled to save him, everyone prayed Klein would show up and steer them in the right direction. Micah, in total shock, still reeling, unable to wrap his head around how Ash had ended up in a situation that bad. Then everyone else started whispering and guessing, wondering if that bear rumor was even real, dead for real, and the big question, had Ash been the one who actually finished it? Even with all their questions, everyone had the same dread. Ash was bleeding badly, and his condition was getting worse by the second. Micah panicked. If that bleeding didn't slow down, Ash wouldn't make it. Her mind raced, desperately searching for anything she could do to stop the nightmare. The idea of never seeing him again, never talking to him, never studying beside him, felt like it would break her in half. And in that wave of despair, she suddenly remembered Ash's instructions for treating injuries, and realized she already had the plan in her bones. Then it hit her hard. Ash had nursed her through that fever, so Micah knew it was her turn to step in and save him. Clenching her resolve, she told everyone to jump on first aid right now. She ordered David and Sheila to haul the Ash straight to her house, then snapped at the nearby villagers to rush her hot water right now, before anything cooled. Tanya stepped up fast and offered help, saying Ban taught her basic first aid. Then she bolted into the forest to grab what they needed, while Folka hurried over with the very book Ash used to study medical treatment, praying it held the right cures for his wounds. Yukiya then pushed Micah to think, was there anyone else out there who could step in and help? She offered her help right away, promised Micah she'd explain everything to the people still at the church, and said she'd rush over to join them as soon as she was able. Fueled by sheer determination, Micah grabbed everyone's attention and pushed, "Hurry, get to my house right now." Right after they got her back to Micah's place, Micah and the others jumped straight into first aid for Ash. As soon as the bandages were on, Tonya said the treatment should steady him and keep his condition from slipping. Folka watched Ash's fever start to ease, and from his own read on the situation, he knew Ash was finally, slowly getting better. Sheila thanked Tanya and Folka for helping her out, and Folka promised he'd dig through even more books and come back if he found anything useful, while Tanya said she'd head home, but told Micah to call her the moment they needed any more help. After Sheila agreed and thanked them one more time, Volka and Tanya finally headed out. Micah's shoulders sagged with relief and exhaustion. He slid down beside Sheila as she tossed over fresh towels and spare bandages, just in case. Sheila thanked her again, and the kindness hit hard. Micah pushed Sheila to take a rest and warned her not to keep on pushing, pushed herself way past her limit, especially if Micah herself showed up looking totally drained. She shot back that she was okay, then leaned into Sheila's worries and made it crystal clear every single thing she was doing was for Ash. Sheila then sank into memories of the day Ash was born, how it all started on a snowy winter night when David first introduced their baby to her. She couldn't stop smiling at the memory him in her arms, a tiny storm of endless energy while they played, and she'd call him exactly that. She said there was no way Ash could have picked a better night to be born, and David nodded along, swearing the sun dropped so fast they could barely manage Ash's first bath before the world went dark. He told them the village chief had saved them by handing out candles right when they needed them, and Sheila immediately said, "Don't forget, we've got to thank him again." Once they got the opening, David shot a question, "Ash, did you fall asleep?" and watched him for a beat, just to be sure. "Listen," he said, "we've got to pick a name for me at the very least. Start thinking about it, unless you think it's too soon." Sheila nodded fast, like there was no time to waste. "We should decide right now, because the least we can do is honor the fact that you made it into the world safe." David started wondering what to name their baby, something that meant healthy growth and real luck, and Sheila jumped in, saying, "Ash was born on a freezing night, so his name should bring warmth and light, no matter what." David nodded hard, because her reasoning was spot on, and he trusted her instincts when it came to names. Sheila suggested a name tied to the sun or the stars, and David jumped in, saying the sun wins every time. Then Sheila fired off more ideas linked to summer and fire, even calling out everyday warmth like stoves and candles. As they debated every option, it hit them dawn had already spilled over the world, and David snapped into action, stepping outside to whip up breakfast. He told them the chef had slipped him some soup, then ordered Sheila to make sure Ash dug in the moment he woke up after that. He turned back to nurse the leftover coals from the day before. All alone with her thoughts, Sheila couldn't stop replaying Ash's name in her head. And then bam, he floated Ash as the real shot. When David heard her pick, he immediately wondered if it was too plain and pressed her on whether she was sure. Sheila admitted it sounded simple, but said she wanted a name that stood for protection and resilience. Sheila told him that since Ash was born into a brutal world, he might never get the easy blessings other kids do, like the ones born in calmer seasons such as spring or autumn. And with his life starting in a remote place full of hardships waiting right around the corner, she believed the name Ash wasn't just a label, it was a promise of pure endurance. She clung to the hope that this name would mean one thing: surviving those brutal, bitter nights and keeping the fire burning right through to the very end. David shot back that a banked fire can't possibly burn without leaving ashes behind. When Sheila pressed him to spell out what he meant, David just nodded and admitted Ash was the perfect name for him. Sheila then thanked Micah for listening and told him she still remembered that moment crystal clear. Micah shot back by telling the tale she'd once heard from Folka about Ash. She still remembered when Ash vanished into the forest with zero trace, no clue, no return, and the worry crushed her heart. Back then, Folka leaned in and told her an ancient legend straight from her own past, like a secret that refused to stay buried. Back in the old days, a god-bird of immortality reigned so powerful it couldn't be truly killed. Every time the bird got hurt or started aging, it hauled in cinnamon branches, lit a magical blaze, and burned itself to finish the ritual. Once the flames died down, the bird would tear itself out of the ashes, reborn stronger, healthier, and ready to soar again. Micah said that this legend was the perfect mirror of Ash's pure strength, full resilience. She leaned in and told Sheila that just like the bird in that tale rising from the ashes, Ash would be okay too, and if they kept tending his wounds the right way, he'd heal up, survive, and be fine. Micah suddenly remembered how Ash had trained her in first aid, and she couldn't help but feel grateful for the help Tanya and Folka had thrown her way. She devoured those medical books, drilled the instructions with everyone until it stuck, and then treated Ash's wounds the exact way they'd taught her. No matter how hard she tried, Ash stayed unconscious for days, and it didn't budge. Overwhelmed by terror and pure exhaustion, Micah finally crumpled and burst into tears, confessing she was scared she'd misread everything and didn't have a clue what was going to happen next. Guilt crashed over her like a wave. She was sure she'd failed him, and that if she'd escaped with Ash sooner, he might never have been hurt. Blinded by guilt, she choked through sobs and begged Sheila for forgiveness. Sheila yanked Micah into a tight hug and whispered that it wasn't her fault, none of it. She saw exactly how hard Micah had worked, pouring her heart into caring for Ash, and she was certain of one thing: Ash would wake up. Eventually, Micah then leaned in and demanded, "How long is Ash stuck like this?" Because the heartbreak hit him fast, he was still dying to talk to her and share everything she had in her heart. She finally confessed she was scared to the bone of losing him, and she couldn't stand the thought of him dying. In that moment, Ash finally stirred, mumbled his apology, and Sheila and Micah froze, then erupted in pure joy as they realized he was awake again. Sheila bolted to call David the second it happened, and Micah stayed planted right beside Ash. She told him how terrified she'd been when he wouldn't wake up, and admitted that she'd been terrified she'd never get another chance to talk to him again. Now that he was awake, Micah burst with relief and gratitude, and tears streamed down her face again as she practically breathed. "I'm so glad you came back to us." Ash turned to her and thanked her for everything she'd done to help him. When Ash woke up, they slammed down strict orders. No matter what, he wasn't allowed to step out of that room. When the farming season hit its peak, and his worries about his test crops and the beekeeping wouldn't let up, this order hit him like a curse still. Everyone shouted in one voice that he had to obey and stay exactly where he was. Ash filled Folka in on what was going on, and Folka shot back that if they took their eyes off Ash, he'd probably snap right back to his usual weird antics. Ash snapped that they were treating him like some kid, and that claim only made the folk burst into laughter. Folka pulled out the very book they'd been talking about, like, "Trust me, Ash, you'd be miserable without this." And Ash took it, grinning as he said he always knew Folka would get exactly why he was fed up. Folka nodded along, saying Ash would have to repay the loan once he was fully recovered, and she told him to come back later, because she'd need his help with some decoding. Ash tried to brush it off, saying he was already drowning in tasks, but Folka stood his ground and reminded him straight up that a loan is still a loan. While he took a break and devoured the book, Ash ended up stuck recovering at the village chief's house for ages. Every time he tried to apologize for the trouble and say thanks, people cut him off, thanking him instead. Yuri even pointed out how wild it was that a giant bear did barely any damage, and she thanked Ash for guarding the village. Ash couldn't shake the feeling that Yuri's constant care had him quietly owing her something, and honestly, he didn't hate that at all. As he kept reading, it hit him he'd always loved this story, and that section on herbal tea recipes had him completely hooked. Ash realized that if he wanted to truly level up life in the village, he'd have to tear through almost every useful church guide. Then the weight of it hit him hard, because pushing forward from there was going to be brutal. He thought about upgrading farming, especially by making fertilizer, but a tidal wave of technical terms hit him hard, and suddenly the whole idea felt impossible to wrap his head around. When he tried to crack chemistry for real, he tore through book after book and found they never explained a single thing the way he needed, because he had. Foka reached out to the temple church in the regional capital to hunt down chemistry texts, but they came up empty, finding nothing worth using. Back then, people hadn't figured out germs or viruses at all. Those things were nothing but hazy rumors, scribbled into old texts like whispers from the past. Technology had advanced in a messy, half-finished way, and Ash didn't have the gear to fix it. His wood stove spat out weak flames that couldn't hold the heat steady, and he had no lab tools strong enough to survive chemical reactions. Without a solid way to measure heat, he was stuck painfully unprepared for chemical experiments, and even getting one batch of fertilizer to work felt like a nightmare still. Boosting food production had to happen no matter what. Recently, though, Ash hit a wall straight up dead end, and he knew he had to start thinking hard about how to get the materials and tools the village was missing. Yukiya showed up a little later and hurried over to ask how Ash was holding up. Ash smiled, greeted her, and thanked her for looking after him. Yukiya breathed out in relief, said he looked well enough to savor his reading, and then right away asked Ash if she could steal a minute with him alone. Ash agreed. Yukiya then leaned in and told him she was sending Micah to her parents' place in the capital for the winter, so she could keep studying without missing a beat. Ash stared into the shadows and realized how much proper education mattered, and Yukiya nodded, saying Micah could already read, write, and do arithmetic, so he'd be fine even without studying in the capital. But she made it clear that learning in the city meant way more than just schoolwork. Ash nodded, realizing that forging real connections and truly understanding the world outside the village mattered just as much. Yukiya nodded and said Micah had leveled up thanks to everything Ash taught her. But Ash shot back that Micah's growth came from her own grit and determination. He only fueled her hunger to learn. Yukiya nodded at Ash's humility. Then, as Micah's mother and the village chief's family, she poured out real gratitude and prayed he'd accept it. Ash blurted out that he felt truly honored by her praise, and he took her thanks with zero hesitation. He couldn't help but feel a rush of pride getting recognized and praised by someone he truly respected. Even as he chased his own dreams, it hit him hard that other people were seeing and valuing every ounce of his effort. Yukiya then shot her and the others a question: could they stay grateful to him forever? Ash told her he got what she meant, and the moment he heard her speak with such raw honesty, he admitted he couldn't stay free anymore without thinking about the weight his choices could drop on everyone else. Yukiya smiled and said this change proved she'd won their little showdown, and Ash nodded right back. Yeah, he'd been outmatched. Ash looked back and realized he never meant to hurt anyone with his reckless choices, but when his emotions surged, he'd make snap decisions without thinking through the fallout. That's probably why Yukiya decided to tug at his heart first, to keep his impulses in check before they wrecked everything. Yukiya felt the truth tug at his freedom, but he also realized maybe he'd been far more reckless than he'd ever admitted. Yukiya, she told him she'd managed to nudge his thoughts in a better direction for now, then eased right back to the real reason she'd come, saying she had a little offer up her sleeve. Ash leaned in and asked what it was. Yukiya asked if Ash wanted to join Micah on the trip to the capital, and the second those words hit, Ash's face lit up. He practically jumped at the chance. He demanded to know when they'd leave, practically vibrating with excitement because he'd heard the capital's temple was gigantic, and he was certain it housed a mountain of books far bigger than anything back in their little village church. The capital turned into a non-stop trade powerhouse, pulling in merchants from nearby villages and cities and opening doors to all kinds of materials, hard-earned knowledge, and cutting-edge technology. Ash could barely contain his excitement at the thought that he'd finally be able to chase the research that had stayed out of reach for so long. Yukiya warned that Ash was already starting to fall back into his old habits, but Ash shot back, denying it, while admitting he was being a little too obvious about just how hyped he was. Yukiya shot back that she'd seen this coming, already had a bunch of ways to sway him, And yeah, the royal capital wasn't better at everything, but the whole atmosphere and the people were totally different from their village. Ash couldn't contain his excitement anymore. He kept thinking, why am I still sitting here and practically burned to sprint off and start preparing right now? But Yukiya softly told him to take a breath and calm down. Ash swallowed his pride, apologized for letting his excitement take over, then leaned in and asked, so when are we heading out? Yukiya told Micah's got to head out during the winter, and if Ash wants, he can go with her. But before that happens, Ash has to talk to his parents, hand off his duties to others, and cram in all kinds of final prep, and she warned they won't be back in the village anytime soon. Ash realized that if he left, he'd be walking away from everything he'd been pouring his heart into his beekeeping work and his personal research and forcing it all to freeze cold, while also knowing he wouldn't get to see the villagers for a long, long time. Time came to that exact moment when Yukiya leaned in and asked if he was suddenly having second thoughts. Ash realized staying in the village would trap his world, but studying in the capital would flip his whole life, pushing him toward a future that finally looked rich. With that unshakable conviction in his chest, he refused to stop and kept moving ahead. Then he asked for permission to go too. Ash nodded, realizing he'd have to set up everything Yukiya had suggested, and he couldn't wait to tell the villagers he wouldn't be around for the winter and he left behind written instructions so whoever took over his job could read them and understand them, and he made it his mission to spread those words as far as possible. Then he wondered aloud if anyone wanted to keep studying while he was gone. He had to crank out even faster on the test fields and slam together every research result he'd collected so far. The idea of crushing these tasks fired him up because it meant the busiest, most intense stretch was right around the corner. Yukiya pointed out it was kind of worrying how much he actually loved juggling all those responsibilities, and he urged him to let his wounds heal before anything else. Ash nodded, swore he'd start with jobs he could handle while staying seated. After he finally caught his breath, Ash marched straight to Folka to lay out his decision. He was heading to the capital. He told him that studying there had always been his dream, and that, on the village chief's say-so, he'd start right away, with the cost of his stay covered too. Fulk stared at Ash's plan to study in the capital, completely stunned. Ash clocked it instantly. This wasn't a quick trip. It meant he'd be gone for ages, and he doubled down, saying he expected to stay there for about 2 years. Back then, he'd get a few chances to slip into the village now and then, but the exact plan wasn't locked in yet. He practically buzzed with excitement at the idea of taking his time to dig through the city's books and sharpen every skill he could, then admitted his injuries were almost healed and that he was already planning his exit. Folka smiled and noticed Ash kept jetting from one obsession to the next, so the people who cared about him had to keep a tight watch on him at all times. Ash shot back that if he was Folka's top disciple, then Folka could at least fret over him a bit more. Folka just chuckled and waved the whole thing off. He snapped and called it nonsense, then went straight for the truth. Ash wasn't the kind of guy to give up or fold that easily. Ash then admitted, during my sickness, I came within a hair of dying. And Folka nodded hard because seeing Ash blazing with that brutal fever only proved again and again how unbreakably resilient he was. Folka leaned in and demanded to know what Ash was even thinking while he fought his way through that brutal fever. Still, Ash told everyone how he kept chanting to himself, I'm not dying, refusing to back down and swearing he'd live no matter what hit him. But everyone chuckled because Ash kept whispering, muttering he wouldn't die, even in his sleep and in his eyes. It made perfect sense. The Grim Reaper finally showed up, came for him, then got so fed up it just turned around and walked away. Left, Ash couldn't help but laugh at it, and he admitted he'd been at his breaking point because there were still so many dreams he hadn't finished yet. Folk caught him in the moment and reminded him he wasn't done yet. So that's exactly why he was rushing into the city. Ash clutched his resolve tight, and Folka shut down the idea of quitting. No doubts, no escape. Ash nodded and told him to go back to his reading, then added, if Folka writes you while I'm gone, I'll make sure you get my reply. Folka nodded and agreed to write him back, because it would give him something to do the moment his work started to stall, and he felt trapped. Ash laughed and basically said you don't even need an excuse like that to go write a letter. As Focus rose to his feet, he ruffled Ash's hair and told him to go all out. When Folka started to slip out, Ash snapped, where are you headed? And Folka just smiled and said he was going for a walk, because doing something like that now and then is good for the body. Back then, Ash teased him asking how a natural-born shut-in like Folka suddenly started walking, and what kind of apocalypse that wild change could be hinting at. Volker brushed off the comment and shot back, "Let's decode it next time we meet." Ash vowed to give it his all, and he wished Volker the very same fire.